There's a specific kind of comfort that comes from a world you already know. The yellow faces, the familiar streets, the same couch, the same family settling in for another evening in a town that has somehow never changed in 36 years. Most people who grew up watching The Simpsons carry it the way you carry a childhood home, not always thinking about it, but knowing it's there, intact, exactly the way you left it, available whenever you need to go back. But underneath the familiarity, underneath the comedy and the warmth, and the music you've had memorized since before you could drive, Springfield has some very strange things in it. Things that, once you start looking at them seriously, raise questions the show has never quite answered. Not mistakes, exactly. Not accidents. Patterns. Recurring structures. Arrangements that look, under the right light, like they were put there deliberately. We're going to spend some time in Springfield tonight. We're going to walk through some of the town's quieter streets, look at some of the people who live there, and ask the questions that the characters themselves never seem to get around to asking. Why does Homer still have his job? Who actually runs this town? What is Sideshow Bob really doing when he lets Bart escape again? What is behind Ned Flanders' smile that the smile was always covering? The tone is going to stay calm. We're not building to revelations here. We're just walking through Springfield slowly. At night, when the streets are empty and nobody needs anything from us, and noticing what's always been there to notice, get comfortable. Let these ideas settle in around you. And whenever you fall asleep, Springfield will still be there when you wake up. That's what it does. It waits. Section 1. The Sector 7G Conspiracy. Homer's employment was never an accident. Homer Simpson has worked at the Springfield nuclear power plant as safety inspector for Sector 7G for the entirety of his adult life. That title, safety inspector, means something specific in the real world. In the show's universe, it is treated with enough formal seriousness that we understand Homer's role to be the human presence, standing between the systems that could fail catastrophically and the regulatory and reporting channels that exist to catch those failures before they become disasters. He is the person who is supposed to notice things. He is the person who is supposed to ask questions. He is the person who is supposed to escalate problems through the appropriate channels to the appropriate authorities. He has been failing at this role, completely and comprehensively, for over 30 years. The show has not been subtle about the scope of Homer's failure. Over 700 documented workplace errors. Sleep through meltdown warnings with such regularity that his workstation appears configured around the assumption that he will be unconscious at it for substantial portions of every shift. Eat donuts during emergency alerts. Dismiss every indicator light, every alarm, every automated warning as background noise that is not really his concern. Cause a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see whether it would increase in size inside the reactor. And this last one is not from a dream sequence or a Treehouse of Horror episode. This is from a regular, fully canonical, this actually happened in Springfield episode of the show. The question the show treats as a joke, how is this man still employed, after 700 errors and decades of documented incapacity, is the question that, when you follow it seriously, leads somewhere very different from comedy. Burns is the key. Burns is always the key. Charles Montgomery Burns has been operating in Springfield for well over a century. The precise age the show assigns to him varies enough across episodes that pinning it down exactly requires some tolerance for continuity inconsistency, but the floor of reasonable estimates puts him in his early hundreds, and the ceiling stretches considerably beyond that. Across that span of time, across every scheme and every arrangement and every interaction the show has depicted him managing, Burns has demonstrated one consistent quality above all others. He does not operate by accident. He does not maintain things that do not serve him. He does not keep people around whose continued presence is not part of some calculation he has made and found favorable. Everything in Burns's world exists because Burns decided it should exist. The nuclear plant, the various corporate entities that surround the plant, the political relationships he has cultivated with municipal and state officials, the medical infrastructure he has built around himself to sustain his impossible longevity. All of it deliberate, all of it intentional. That includes Homer. The piece of evidence that makes this undeniable is the episode in which German investors purchase the plant from Burns. A group of organized, professional business people acquire the facility and immediately begin doing what competent new owners of an industrial enterprise do. They assess what they've purchased. They evaluate the workforce. They look at the compliance status of the facility against relevant regulations. They do, in other words, exactly the kind of careful examination that the plant has never received from its long-term owner, who has a very specific interest in that examination not occurring. The German investors fire Homer within their first days of ownership. This part gets treated as the first beat of the comedy. They see immediately what Burns apparently hasn't noticed across years of employment. But the second beat is what matters more. The investors request an estimate on what it would cost to bring the plant into regulatory compliance. And the estimate they receive is catastrophic. The violations are not the kind that can be addressed through surface remediation. They are structural, foundational, embedded so deeply in the facility's basic operation that correcting them would require essentially rebuilding significant portions of the plant. The cost of compliance exceeds any reasonable valuation of the asset. The Germans have purchased a liability disguised as an asset, and they sell the plant back to Burns at a price that reflects this discovery. Burns reacquires the plant. And immediately, not eventually, not after consideration, but immediately he restores all the old arrangements. And he rehires Homer Simpson. The show frames this as comedy. The implication is that Burns is either too old to notice the obvious problems, or so set in his ways that he defaults back to the familiar regardless of evidence. But neither of those framings survives contact with what we actually know about Burns. Burns is not a man who misses obvious things. Burns is not a man who makes decisions out of mere habit. Burns is a man who has survived a century of operating at the apex of Springfield's power structure through precisely the opposite of inattention. He does not keep Homer in Sector 7G because he hasn't noticed Homer's incompetence. He keeps Homer there because Homer's incompetence is doing something for him. Here is what Homer's incompetence does for Burns. It keeps the regulatory apparatus pointed away from the plant's actual condition. The plant has hundreds of safety violations. The show has been specific about this across multiple episodes: the cracked cooling towers patched with chewing gum, the radioactive waste going directly into bodies of water, the luminous rats running through the facility's infrastructure, the plutonium being used as a desk paperweight. These are violations that, if flagged by a competent safety inspector through proper regulatory channels, would not result in fines. They would result in shutdown. They would result in the kind of federal environmental enforcement action that would make it impossible for Burns to continue operating the facility in its current state. Burns has made the deliberate calculation that he is not going to fix these violations. He has made this calculation because fixing them would cost more than maintaining them, and because maintaining them with adequate protection from regulatory scrutiny is achievable through a specific mechanism. The mechanism is Homer. The least risky way to protect against a competent safety inspector finding your violations is not to bribe a competent inspector. Bribery is documented. Bribery creates a person who knows they're being paid to look the other way, which means a person who has leverage over you and who might, at some point, for any number of reasons, decide to use that leverage. A whistleblower who was once bribed is in many ways a more dangerous whistleblower than one who was never approached, because they have inside knowledge and the moral cover that comes from admitting prior complicity. The cleaner solution is to have a genuine incompetent in the role. Someone who is not pretending not to see the violations. Someone who actually legitimately, comprehensively does not have the cognitive capacity to understand what they're looking at when they're looking at it. Someone for whom the cracked cooling tower is just how a cooling tower looks, because they have no baseline for comparison. Someone for whom the warning light that has been on continuously for 3 weeks is just another light in a room full of lights, not distinguishable as significant from any of the others. A person performing incompetence is vulnerable in ways that genuine incompetence is not. A performance can be detected, especially by regulators specifically trained to look for it. Genuine cognitive limitation produces behavior that is consistent across all contexts, that doesn't have the tells of performance, that passes the kind of scrutiny that catches bad actors, but that cannot do much about people who genuinely don't understand what they're supposed to be doing. Homer is genuinely incompetent. This is not performance. His failure is authentic, total, and consistent. If a federal regulator were to interview Homer about a specific violation that Homer should have flagged, Homer's response would be the response of a man who genuinely cannot understand why that would be a violation, because his cognitive limitations are real enough that he actually cannot understand this. You cannot prosecute someone for not comprehending what they demonstrably cannot comprehend. Homer is Burns's most sophisticated legal protection, and Homer has no idea he is Burns's most sophisticated legal protection. The second layer of the architecture is the Grandpa Simpson arrangement. Across several episodes, with some variation in the details, the show has established that there was an arrangement between Abraham Simpson and Burns, that Burns had some kind of transgression in his past that Grandpa became aware of, and that rather than acting on that knowledge through legal channels, a deal was made. The deal's terms included a guarantee. Homer Simpson would always have a job at the plant, protected employment regardless of performance, a guarantee that held across the German investor's ownership and would hold across any subsequent regime, because Burns ensured he was in a position to keep the guarantee by retaining or regaining control of the facility. This arrangement means that Burns secured Homer's position before Homer had done anything to demonstrate his usefulness. Before Homer accumulated Error 1, before he fell asleep at his console for the first time, Burns had made the arrangement that guaranteed Homer would remain in Sector 7G regardless of what happened. The arrangement was made in advance because Burns had already thought through the requirements carefully enough to know that simple employment was insufficient. He needed the structural protection that a contractual guarantee provided. Why would Burns make this arrangement rather than simply hiring Homer and trusting that Homer's visible incompetence would make it difficult to justify firing him? Because a person who can be fired, even if firing them would require effort and justification, is a person who creates at least theoretical risk. A person whose employment is guaranteed by arrangement is a person around whom the theoretical risk has been eliminated in advance. Burns thinks in exactly these terms. Burns has survived a century partly by eliminating theoretical risks before they become practical ones. Now add the layer that makes this not simply a clever business strategy, but something considerably darker. Burns did not happen upon Homer Simpson as a convenient tool. Burns has a specific prior relationship with the Simpson family that begins decades before Homer's employment at the plant. Mona Simpson, Homer's mother, was a political activist in the late 1960s who participated in a raid on a biological weapons laboratory that Burns owned and operated in Springfield. She was part of a group that believed, with justification according to what the show establishes, that Burns was manufacturing dangerous biological agents in a facility located within the community where her family lived. The raid destroyed the biological agents stored in the laboratory, and during the escape from the facility, Mona made the mistake of stopping to help someone she found in the chaos. That person was Burns. He saw her face. He identified her to federal authorities. She became a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her husband. She could not be present for her son. She kissed Homer goodbye while he slept. He was 6 years old and disappeared into hiding for more than 27 years. Homer grew up believing his mother was dead. Abe told him she had died when Homer was young. Homer mourned a loss that was not the loss he was told it was. He spent his entire childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood carrying the specific wound of a child whose mother had, in some fundamental and irrecoverable sense, left him. And that wound shaped everything about the adult Homer became. The desperate need for approval, the terror of abandonment that manifests in his compulsive need to maintain any stable relationship, even a bad one. The inability to challenge authority figures who hold his sense of security in their hands, the willingness to endure humiliation and poor treatment rather than risk the loss of the position that provides the stability that the absence of his mother made him permanently need. Burns watched all of this happen. Burns has been in Springfield for a century. He has watched the people who live there across multiple generations. He watched a 6-year-old become a 12-year-old, become a 17-year-old, become an adult who carried the specific psychological formation that his mother's forced absence had produced. And at some point, through deliberate calculation, or through the opportunistic recognition of a man who has always known how to identify a useful circumstance, Burns understood that this specific adult, this specific combination of cognitive limitation and psychologically produced dependency and inability to challenge the authority of his employer, was precisely what the role in Sector 7G required. Burns did not create Homer's damage. He leveraged it. He recognized it as useful and made the arrangement that guaranteed he would always have access to it. The deal with Grandpa is the formal expression of this recognition, not simply the buying of silence about some past transgression, but the securing of access to exactly the kind of employee that the plant needed in its most sensitive role. The crayon episode is where all of this becomes fully legible. In Season 12, Homer has the crayon removed from his brain, a crayon that has been lodged in his skull since childhood, physically obstructing certain cognitive functions that the obstruction had diminished. With the crayon removed, Homer's intelligence is temporarily restored to something significantly closer to what it would have been without the obstruction. And the Homer who emerges from this procedure goes to work at the plant. He looks at the plant with clear eyes. He reads the instruments he has been ignoring. He makes connections between what those instruments are telling him and what they should be telling him versus what they are actually telling him. He identifies things that are wrong. He begins composing a report, a real report, the kind that would go through proper channels to the regulatory agencies whose entire institutional function is to receive exactly this kind of information. Burns's response to this development is immediate, calibrated, and revealing. He applies pressure, not random pressure. Specifically targeted pressure applied to the exact psychological vulnerabilities that Homer's specific history has created and that Burns's position in Homer's life means he has complete access to. The job, which is Homer's financial stability and his sense of identity as a provider, and the one stable thing he has built his adult life around. The family that depends on the job, the house and the security and the sense of belonging that are all downstream of the continued employment. Burns applies pressure to exactly the right points to make, continuing with intelligence more threatening to Homer's deepest needs than retreating to the familiar incapacity. Homer has the crayon put back in. He chooses, consciously and voluntarily, to restore his own cognitive limitation rather than live as a competent person in a world whose response to his competence is this threatening. The show treats this as tragedy, a man choosing the fog, because the light is too much, and it is tragedy, genuinely. But it is also confirmation of the system. When Smart Homer emerged, Burns had an immediate, practiced, perfectly calibrated response ready. This is not how you respond to something you didn't anticipate. This is how you respond to something you have thought through in advance. That preparedness tells us something important. Burns has been paying very close attention to Homer Simpson for a very long time. The apparent contempt, the forgetting of Homer's name, the dismissal, the treatment of Homer as interchangeable and beneath notice is itself part of the system. An employer who is watching you closely and managing your behavior through that watching has very strong incentives to make sure you don't know you're being watched. Homer experiencing Burns as contemptuous and inattentive is exactly what Burns needs Homer to experience. If Homer understood that Burns knew his vulnerabilities precisely, had selected him for Sector 7G specifically, had arranged through his grandfather for his permanent employment, and was actively managing his continued incapacity, Homer would be in a fundamentally different relationship with his employer than the one the system requires. The system requires Homer to experience his employment as fortunate rather than as designed. The contempt performs that function. Homer is not a mistake Burns made that he can't be bothered to correct. Homer is the solution. Homer is the specifically, carefully, multiply-secured solution to the problem Burns needed solved. How to operate a facility with hundreds of safety violations without those violations triggering the regulatory response that would make continued operation impossible. The donuts in Homer's desk drawer are not the failure of an incompetent man. They are Burns's investment in the system. The security that Homer can't risk by becoming competent is Burns's engineering, built from the specific materials of Homer's psychological history. Homer Simpson has worked in Sector 7G his entire adult life. He is, by any measure, the worst employee the plant has ever had. He is also, by a different and more accurate measure, the most important employee the plant has ever had. He just has no way of knowing this. And his not knowing is the whole point. 700 errors is not a record of failure. It is a record of the system working as designed. If you're still awake, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's one of the best parts of these videos, reading where everyone is around the world. And if you want more of this kind of thing, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss the next one. Now let's keep going. Section 2. Fat Tony's Shadow Government. The mob actually runs Springfield. There is a version of Springfield's civic life that is visible on the surface. Mayor Quimby gives speeches, Chief Wiggum runs the police department, various institutions perform their institutional functions with varying degrees of competence and comedy. And then there is the version that operates underneath that surface, which has been visible in the show's background and foreground since the very early seasons, and which becomes, once you start tracking it carefully, a fairly coherent portrait of how a small American city actually maintains the arrangement between its formal power structure and its informal one. Fat Tony D'Amico is not a background character. He appears with enough regularity across enough seasons in enough plot-relevant situations that the show has clearly decided he serves a structural function in Springfield's world, rather than simply being a comic recurring figure. He is the head of the Springfield mob, which the show depicts as a genuine criminal organization with real operations, waste management, labor racketeering, the restaurant business, gambling, various other enterprises that have specific historical counterparts in the actual organized crime structures of mid-size American cities. He is also, in almost every episode where he appears, operating in comfortable accommodation with the formal institutions of the town. Not hiding from them, not at war with them, operating alongside them in the practiced, mutually beneficial way that suggests the accommodation has been running long enough to have developed its own routines. The relationship between Fat Tony and Mayor Quimby is the clearest expression of this. Quimby is corrupt in a very specific way, not the chaotic, opportunistic corruption of someone who takes whatever is available, but the structured, institutional corruption of a politician who has arrangements and maintains them. He takes things from specific people in exchange for specific things, and the transaction is governed enough by mutual understanding that both parties know what the other will and won't do. Fat Tony is one of the primary parties on the other side of this arrangement. The mob funds campaigns, provides resources, operates in ways that would require political protection if they were to operate safely, and receives the protection in exchange for the funding and resources. This is the standard architecture of machine politics in American cities, depicted in The Simpsons with enough specificity that the show clearly had people on staff who understood how it actually works. What makes Springfield's version interesting is the additional layer, Burns. Because Burns' relationship to both Quimby and Fat Tony is not the relationship of an outsider trying to gain access to an established arrangement. Burns is the arrangement's senior partner, the party whose resources and whose long-term presence in Springfield mean that both the formal political structure and the informal criminal structure have been operating within the framework he established. Quimby doesn't have independent power in Springfield. He has power that Burns permits him to have, in exchange for the performance of political functions that Burns needs performed. Fat Tony doesn't operate independently of Burns' sphere. He operates in the space that Burns has not chosen to occupy directly, which is a different thing. The implication, once you follow this through, is that Springfield's governance structure is essentially a franchise operation. Burns is the franchisor, Quimby runs the political franchise, Fat Tony runs the criminal franchise. Each of them operates within their designated territory, takes their portion of the available value, and maintains the understood boundaries. The formal and informal structures of the town are not in competition with each other. They are coordinated, in the way that complex systems coordinate when the parties within them have been operating together long enough to have internalized each other's requirements. Chief Wiggum sits at the intersection of this, which is why understanding Wiggum is necessary for understanding how the whole arrangement functions. Wiggum's role is to maintain the appearance of law enforcement sufficient to satisfy the town's residents that law enforcement exists, while ensuring that the actual operation of law enforcement does not interfere with the arrangements that the town's power structure depends on. This requires a specific skill set that is different from the incompetence the show presents on the surface. It requires knowing which cases to close and which ones to let stay open. It requires knowing where the lines are and staying inside them. It requires the ability to perform the ritual of law enforcement, the arrests, the investigations, the press conferences without the substance of law enforcement, which would mean actually following the evidence wherever it went, regardless of where that was. Wiggum manages this with a consistency that is not well explained by simple incompetence. Random incompetence would close some of the important cases by accident. Wiggum's record is too clean. The cases connected to Fat Tony's operations consistently fail to produce convictions, while the peripheral cases, the cases that don't touch the arrangement, get resolved often enough to maintain the institution's credibility. That kind of selective success rate is itself a skill, and it requires someone who understands the landscape well enough to navigate it deliberately. Now look at Bart's relationship with Fat Tony, which the show has returned to across multiple seasons and which has a specific texture to it that rewards attention. Bart is recruited into Fat Tony's orbit more than once across the show's run. He proves useful in specific ways. His age makes him legally untouchable in most jurisdictions. His natural improvisational intelligence makes him effective at the kinds of quick response tasks that criminal enterprises sometimes need, and his relationship with authority has always been fundamentally different from the one most Springfield residents maintain. Bart does not have the learned compliance that the town's general population has developed across decades of living under Burns's economic dominance. He has not been broken in the way Homer has been broken. He has not been conditioned in the way Ned has been conditioned. He is, in a town of compliant and adapted people, genuinely unruly in ways that a criminal organization finds useful. Fat Tony recognizes something in Bart that most of the adults in Bart's life have been trying to suppress, that the same quality that makes Bart a difficult child would, directed differently, make him an effective and creative adult. The mob offers Bart a version of recognition that Springfield's formal structures never quite manage. It sees what he is rather than what he's supposed to become, and it has uses for what he is rather than reasons to correct it. The show never lets this develop into anything permanent, because the reset mechanism prevents it, and also because the show is correctly not in the business of glamorizing organized crime to children. But the recurring nature of the dynamic Bart drawn in, Bart useful, Bart eventually extracted by the episode's conclusion, suggests that the show has thought carefully about what the pull actually is. Bart keeps finding himself in Fat Tony's world because Fat Tony's world is one of the few places in Springfield where the specific qualities Bart has are assets rather than problems. What the shadow government theory ultimately proposes is that Springfield's apparent chaos, the incompetent mayor, the corrupt police chief, the mob running businesses openly, the nuclear plant operating with hundreds of violations is not actually chaos. It is an equilibrium, a stable arrangement maintained by parties who have been operating within it long enough to understand its requirements. The chaos is the surface. The surface exists to prevent anyone from looking too carefully at the structure beneath. And the structure beneath is Burns's, as it has always been. The shadow government doesn't control Springfield because it seized control. It controls Springfield because Burns built it that way and has maintained it that way for over a century. And because a century of maintenance has made the arrangement feel natural to everyone operating within it, which is the most durable form of control that exists. Natural feeling arrangements are the ones nobody thinks to question. Springfield residents look at Quimby and see a corrupt mayor. They look at Fat Tony and see a colorful mob boss. They look at Wiggum and see an incompetent police chief. They never look at all three simultaneously and ask what it would mean if none of this were accidental. If the corruption, the organized crime, the selective incompetence of the police were all components of a single system that someone designed and has been maintaining. If they looked at it that way, they might start asking who benefits from the arrangement as a whole rather than who benefits from each piece individually. And the answer to that question only has one name. The shadow government runs Springfield, and Springfield runs for Burns. Section 3. The Treehouse of Horror Problems. Some of it actually happened. Every October, The Simpsons airs one of its Treehouse of Horror episodes. 3 short stories, each one departing from the show's normal reality in some significant direction. Horror scenarios, science fiction premises, supernatural events, fairy tale adaptations. The characters die. They encounter aliens. They become monsters. The laws of the show's usual universe are suspended for the duration. And at the end, the episode concludes with a postscript joke or an acknowledgement of the format, and the regular show resumes the following week with nothing from the Treehouse episode carried forward. The official position on the Treehouse episodes is that they are explicitly non-canonical. They exist in their own separate space, clearly demarcated from the regular continuity, allowed to do things the regular show cannot do precisely because everyone understands they don't count. You can kill Bart in a Treehouse episode because everyone watching knows Bart will be fine next week. You can destroy Springfield because the show's universe will be intact when October is over. This is the official position. And it is, in most respects, the accurate one. Except for the places where things bleed through. The bleeding is not dramatic. It's not the kind of thing that produces a definitive moment where a Treehouse element clearly crosses into the regular continuity in a way the show acknowledges. It's subtler than that, a texture issue, a recurring tendency for the horror episodes to do things with the characters that feel like they're accessing something real rather than something invented for the anthology format. A sense, across certain specific Treehouse segments, that the show is using the non-canonical space to say things about these characters that it cannot say in the regular episodes. The most important Treehouse segment to examine with this framework is The Shining from Treehouse of Horror V. This is the show's parody of The Shining, with the family stranded in a large isolated estate for the winter, Homer going progressively unhinged, and the episode following the general architecture of Kubrick's film with Springfield-specific modifications. On its surface, it is a parody, an extremely well-executed parody, one of the best pieces of television comedy the show has produced, and the official reading is that it is exactly and only that. A Treehouse segment. Non-canonical. A joke. But look at what the segment is actually depicting. Homer, deprived of television and beer, becomes violent. He becomes fixated on killing his family. He pursues them through the estate with an axe. The segment plays the escalation for comedy, but the underlying progression, Homer, without the distraction of beer and television, without the numbing agents that make his daily existence bearable, becoming someone who turns on his family, is depicting something the regular show circles around without ever quite saying directly. The regular show has Homer strangling Bart as a recurring gag. It has Homer's relationship with beer as a central character feature. It has Homer's couch, Homer's television, Homer's donuts as the things that keep him in his comfortable stupor. The Treehouse episode, by removing those things in a horror context, shows you what the regular show is implying but cannot state, that the numbing agents are doing something important, that without them, Homer's relationship to his family is not entirely what the comedy suggests, that there is something underneath the bumbling, lovable father persona that the persona is there to keep from surfacing. This is not comfortable. It's not the kind of thing the show can say in a regular episode because the show needs Homer to be the character he is in the regular episodes. But the Treehouse format allows it to be said, wrapped in genre parody, with the non-canonical label available as a disclaimer if anyone looks too closely. Homer 3 from Treehouse of Horror 6 takes a different approach to the bleeding. Homer discovers a portal into the third dimension and enters it, and the episode spends extended time in the three-dimensional CGI space that Homer has fallen into before returning him to the two-dimensional world. At the end of the segment, Homer does not return to Springfield. He emerges into what appears to be the real world, the actual live-action world, filmed rather than animated, and the segment ends with him discovering an erotic cake shop and wandering in. This is played as a joke, but the joke leaves Homer outside the show's universe in a way that is never formally resolved. The next episode does not explain how he got back. He simply is back the way he is always back after Treehouse episodes, and the question of how is not asked because the Treehouse non-canonical disclaimer covers it. Except what the episode actually showed is Homer finding an exit, finding the membrane of his world and passing through it, and the other side containing something that satisfied him enough to walk into. The coma theory, people have noted this. If Homer has been dreaming since 1993, then the Treehouse episodes are a different kind of dream within the dream. The spaces where the sleeping mind's internal logic loosens further, where the narrative control relaxes and stranger things can happen. And Homer 3 is the moment the dreaming mind briefly touches the real world, the actual world where Homer's body is lying in a hospital bed, before retreating back into the dream, because the real world is unfamiliar, and the erotic cake shop at least makes a certain kind of sense to the unconscious. The other bleeding that deserves attention is tonal rather than plot-specific. The Treehouse episodes have, across the show's run, operated as a kind of pressure release for the show's darker impulses, the things the show wants to explore but cannot explore in the regular format because the regular format has requirements. Requirements of comedy, of family appropriateness, of character consistency, of the reset mechanism that ensures the next episode can proceed normally. In the Treehouse space, those requirements are relaxed. And in that relaxed space, the show keeps returning to certain themes. The fragility of the family, the violence that exists within ordinary domestic situations, the ease with which the familiar can become monstrous, the sense that the comfortable suburban world of Springfield is a thin surface over something considerably less comfortable. These themes are not invented for October. They are the themes the regular show has been dancing around for 36 years. The Treehouse episodes are just the space where the dancing stops and the show looks directly at them. Is any of it canonical? The official answer is no. But the question might be less important than it seems. The canon is where the show puts the things it wants everyone to accept as true. The Treehouse episodes are where the show puts the things it wants to express but cannot make canonical. And what the show wants to express in that space, the things it keeps returning to, the themes it keeps exploring, those are at least as revealing as what the show says officially. The horror episodes are the show dreaming. And what a show dreams about is not unrelated to who the show is. There is one more bleeding worth noting, smaller but specific. In the regular continuity, certain elements that first appeared in Treehouse episodes have gradually migrated into the regular show in ways that blur the demarcation. Kang and Kodos, the alien characters who appeared initially in Treehouse segments, have made appearances in regular episodes in capacities that are not entirely non-canonical. The supernatural elements that the show uses for comedy in regular episodes, the moments where something impossible happens and gets treated as background, are formally different from Treehouse impossibilities but occupy a similar space in the show's logic. Springfield has always been a town where the impossible happens. The Treehouse episodes are the formal acknowledgement of this. The regular episodes are the place where the impossible happens, and nobody calls it that. The line between them has always been thinner than the format claims. Section 4. Sideshow Bob's Long Game, a genius who cannot afford to win. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. has tried to kill Bart Simpson more times than the show has bothered to count. He has been thwarted every time, and the thwarting has been, across decades of attempts, sufficiently comprehensive and sufficiently consistent that a reasonable observer would have to consider the possibility that the pattern is not accidental. That Sideshow Bob, who is by every available measure one of the most intelligent people in Springfield, who has multiple academic degrees, who demonstrates in every episode a planning capability that far exceeds anyone else in the show's universe, who has executed complex multi-stage schemes that required sustained cognitive effort and careful management of contingencies, that this person has been failing to kill a child for 30-plus years for reasons that are not simply bad luck. Start with what Bob is, in the episodes where he's allowed to be himself rather than in the middle of an attempted murder. He is cultured in the specific way of someone whose relationship to high culture is genuine rather than performed. He recites Sondheim. He quotes classical literature with the ease of someone who read it rather than someone who memorized it for the occasion. He sings opera in moments of emotion in a way that suggests the opera is actually how his emotional processing works, rather than a comedic affectation. His taste is real, his intelligence is real, his aesthetic sensibility is real. And then there is the clown suit, and the slapstick, and the rakes, and the recurring humiliation, and the decade of working as the silent sidekick to a children's entertainer whose act was built around violence and stupidity. Krusty, who cannot remember jokes, who treats Bob as interchangeable furniture, who becomes the vehicle through which Springfield's children encounter a specific kind of comic chaos. And Bob, who sets the charges for the bit and gets the pie to arrive and builds the architecture that makes the entertainment function, and receives no credit for any of it because sidekicks don't receive credit. The resentment that led to Bob framing Krusty was real. The intelligence that executed the framing was real. The jury's conviction was real. And then Bart, who had no particular stake in the outcome except his love for Krusty's programming, took the specific situation apart and exposed the framing. A 10-year-old child dismantled Bob's plan, and Bob went to prison, and the entire trajectory of Bob's adult life changed in that moment. What happened next is the thing that deserves the most careful attention. Bob could have let it go. He had a legitimate grievance against Krusty, which was real enough that even in prison he managed to get himself elected to public office, which suggests he had access to persuasion and communication capabilities that most imprisoned people do not have. He could have directed those capabilities toward rebuilding a life that was not organized around Bart Simpson. He had the intelligence to do this. He had the aptitude. He had, in certain episodes, access to resources and to communities that would have supported a different kind of ambition. He chose Bart instead. He chose Bart with a thoroughness and a consistency that has persisted across decades and across every conceivable setback. Every escape from prison, every plot, every elaborate scheme has been oriented around the same axis. The schemes get more elaborate. The methods change. The geography changes. Bob has operated in various locations across the show's run, has involved himself in various other activities and relationships, but the through line is always the same. Back to Springfield. Back to Bart. Back to the attempt that will fail again. Why? The fan reading that makes the most sense is not that Bob is obsessed with revenge in the simple sense of the word. It's that the relationship with Bart is the thing Bob is organized around, the thing that gives his life its structure and its purpose. In a world where Bob could not get credit for his talents, where his genuine abilities were subordinated to Krusty's mediocrities, where his intelligence produced nothing but the invisible scaffolding of someone else's success, the conflict with Bart is the one arena where his intelligence is the acknowledged center of the action. The Springfield Police Department takes Bob seriously. The episodes structure themselves around Bob's plots. The show gives him the full weight of its dramatic attention when he appears. For a man who spent years as a silent sidekick, this is not nothing. This is, in fact, the first time his capabilities have been recognized as the thing the situation turns on. Killing Bart would end this. Killing Bart would remove the only relationship in Bob's life that is genuinely organized around what Bob is. And Bob, at some level that the show suggests, without quite stating, understands this. The schemes come close enough to be taken seriously. They demonstrate his capability. They prove the intelligence is real and the threat is real. And then they fail, at the last step, in ways that look like bad luck from the outside, but that might from the inside look like something else. The rake sequence is the show's most extended joke at Bob's expense. Bob stepping on rake after rake, each blow to the face delivered with the full Looney Tunes commitment to physical comedy for an extended and increasingly absurd period. The audience laughs. The intended reading is that Bob's grandiosity has been punctured by something as stupid as a series of garden tools. But the rake sequence is also Bob, who has been planning a complex scheme, encountering a trivially simple obstacle and failing to navigate it. Not because the obstacle is genuinely insurmountable, because at some level, Bob's relationship to success and failure is not what his stated goals suggest. Bob wants to kill Bart. Bob needs to not kill Bart. The tension between these two things has been the engine of his character for the entirety of his arc, and the show has occasionally let the tension become explicit. In one episode, Bob and Bart are forced to work together. In another, Bob saves Bart's life because the show has put them in a situation where saving Bart is the only option consistent with Bob's other values. These moments are not anomalies. They are the visible expression of the thing that the murder plots are covering over. Bob's relationship with Bart is the deepest thing in Bob's life. The murder plot is the form that the relationship has to take in order to exist at all, given how the relationship began. But the plot is the surface and the relationship is the depth. The planning that goes into each attempt, the complexity of the schemes, the sustained engagement with Bart as the center of his intellectual and emotional attention. This is what love looks like in a man who cannot acknowledge love, and so has organized it around its apparent opposite. The Gilbert and Sullivan episode makes this explicit. In Krusty Studios, Bob sings. He sings beautifully, with the full operatic capability he has always possessed, and the song is about his vendetta, and the song is magnificent, and Bart listens. The sophistication of the musical moment, the care with which the show builds it, the way Bart's response to the performance is one of the most genuinely warm moments in their relationship. This is the show acknowledging what it has been building for years. These two, in a different world, in a world where Bob had not committed a crime that Bart had exposed, would have been something other than what they are. The vendetta is the tragedy, and the relationship is the love story, and the show knows this, even if it cannot quite commit to saying it. Bob will try to kill Bart again. He will fail. He will return to prison or to exile or to whatever situation the episode places him in. And the next time he appears, he will have another scheme, another plan, another elaborate architecture of intended harm that will fail at the crucial moment. And Springfield will be intact, and Bart will be 10, and Bob will be exactly who he is, organizing his life around the one relationship that recognizes what he is, even if the recognition comes in this particular and permanently frustrated form. The long game has no end point. That's the point. Section 5. Krusty's Hidden Empire, the sadness behind the paint. The thing that makes Krusty the Clown interesting is not the corruption or the gambling or the mob connections or the tax evasion or the product endorsements for things that are genuinely harmful to children. Those are funny, but they are surface. The thing that makes Krusty interesting is what the makeup is covering. His real name is Herschel Shmoykel Pinchas Yeruchim Krustovsky. His father is Rabbi Hyman Krustovsky, a man of genuine spiritual distinction and genuine warmth and genuine love for his son, who spent decades estranged from that son because of a dispute about a career choice that felt, from the outside of the relationship, impossible to sustain. The rabbi had a son who wanted to be an entertainer. The rabbi's tradition and his sense of himself and the specific weight that the rabbi carries in his community as a spiritual leader meant that he could not accommodate that choice, could not publicly accept a son who was going to be a clown, and the gap between what he could accept and what his son needed to be opened into an estrangement that lasted for years. Krusty, in public, is everything the rabbi is not. He is loud where his father is measured. He is crude where his father is refined. He smokes, heavily, on camera, in a children's program, because the cigarette is one of the ways the persona is built. The deliberate contrast with everything respectable and careful and considered that his father represented. The persona is the negation of Rabbi Krustovsky, performed in grease paint every afternoon for an audience of Springfield's children. But here is the thing about performing the negation of your father. You are still organized around your father. The negation is as thorough a form of organization as the imitation would be. Krusty cannot not be his father's son, no matter how much of himself he puts into the performance of not being his father's son. Every cigarette is in dialogue with the rabbi. Every crude joke is in dialogue with the rabbi's learning. Every piece of the Krusty persona is constructed in relation to the thing it is demonstrating it is not. Bart understands this, at some level, from an early age. It's not stated in the episode where Bart reunites Krusty with his father, but the episode gives Bart the role of seeing the situation clearly enough to fix it, and kids who see situations that clearly tend to see them because something in the situation rhymes with their own experience. Bart's relationship with Homer has its own dynamics around recognition and the need for approval, and the specific pain of caring what someone thinks while appearing not to care. The Krusty Rabbi situation is not the same, but the architecture is recognizable enough that Bart finds himself moved to act. The reconciliation happens, father and son talk, the estrangement ends, and then the show, which is not a show that tends to carry its resolutions forward with full seriousness, continues depicting Krusty as essentially the same. Because the reconciliation with the rabbi fixes the estrangement but does not fix the condition that the clown persona is managing. What is the condition? It is the condition of being someone who found, early, that certain things about themselves were not receivable in the environment where they grew up. That the things they were good at, the things they wanted to do, the specific person they were, there was not a place for that person in the world the rabbi's community represented. And so, the clown emerged. The persona built out of negation and performance, and the specific comedic aggression of someone who learned to be funny as a defense before they learned it could be a career. The entertainer and the person have long since become difficult to distinguish. Krusty's offstage behavior is not meaningfully different from his onstage behavior. The cigarettes happen on camera and off. The gambling happens when the cameras are not present but happens with the same urgency. The persona has been running long enough that whatever was underneath it when it started has been substantially replaced by it. Krusty is not playing Krusty. Krusty is Krusty, which means the rabbi's son, the Herschel that the rabbi was estranged from, no longer quite exists in the form it would have needed to exist to be received back into the rabbi's world. The reconciliation happened, but what reconciled was Krusty and his father, not Herschel and his father. And Krusty and his father love each other and can now be in the same room, but they are not the same people they were before the estrangement, and the world that the estrangement began in does not quite exist anymore either. The mob connections add a layer that the show handles with its characteristic lightness, but that has some weight to it. The specific shape of Krusty's mob relationship, not a power relationship, not the relationship of someone who has leverage, but the relationship of someone who owes favors and has been generating the need for those favors for years, through the gambling and through various other arrangements that required the kind of informal financing and informal problem-solving that organized crime is in the business of providing. This is the shape that a certain kind of debt takes when it accumulates without plan or intention across enough time. Krusty did not set out to be in debt to Fat Tony's organization. He set out to be an entertainer, and he made the choices that entertainers in his specific situation make, and enough of those choices created enough dependence on the resources that Fat Tony's organization provides that the dependence became structural. He cannot exit it cleanly because too much of what keeps his operation running is entangled with it. The children's entertainer who is in debt to organized crime is a comedy premise. It is also, if you look at it directly, A portrait of someone who has spent long enough running the persona and making the decisions the persona makes, that the consequences of those decisions have taken on a life of their own that the persona alone cannot manage. The grease paint cannot handle the mob. The gags cannot handle the debt. The person underneath, whatever form that person now takes, has to actually engage with the consequences that the persona has generated. Krusty always pays the debt. He always finds the money or the favor or the arrangement that keeps him operational. He has been doing this for decades with a reliable consistency that is itself a kind of competence. The management of this situation, the continued ability to keep the show running, and the debts serviced and the mob accommodated, and the rabbi occasionally seen on holidays and the cigarettes lit and the children entertained, this requires a certain kind of person. Not the person the rabbi hoped for, not the person Krusty might have been in a different arrangement. The person that all of these pressures over all of these years have produced. And on camera, every afternoon the grease paint goes on and the lights come up and Krusty does the voice and Springfield's children laugh. It is not nothing. The laughter is real. The children's enjoyment is real. Whatever compromise and pain and accumulated consequence went into producing the thing that produces the laughter is still real. And in Springfield, real laughter is not as common as it might be. That might be enough. It might not. But it's what Krusty has, and he keeps showing up to deliver it. Every afternoon? Without fail. Section 6. The Springfield Police and the Theory of Deliberate Failure. Chief Clancy Wiggum has, across the entirety of The Simpsons, demonstrated a failure rate in law enforcement that would be remarkable even as obvious satire. But it goes beyond simple incompetence into territory that, once you begin tracking it carefully, has a specific shape, not uniform failure, not the random incompetence of a man who simply cannot perform his job regardless of what that job is. A particular, patterned failure that consistently falls around certain kinds of cases while clearing, just as consistently around others. The standard reading of Wiggum is that he is a buffoon. He eats on duty, demonstrably and enthusiastically. He makes arrests based on criteria that have no logical relationship to evidence. He confuses suspects with witnesses, victims with perpetrators, relevant details with irrelevant ones. He is, in the show's universe, the small-town police chief that corrupt small-town governance produces so visibly, so comprehensively incapable of performing his stated function that the town's law enforcement apparatus is, in any meaningful sense, absent. This reading is not wrong. But it is incomplete, because Wiggum is not uniformly incompetent. He has, across dozens of episodes, demonstrated moments of genuine situational awareness that are inconsistent with the buffoon characterization. He has correctly identified actual criminals on specific occasions. He has shown understanding of Springfield's political landscape of who the relevant players are, what their interests are, how power moves through the town that requires a kind of attention to his environment that pure incompetence would not produce. The theory that emerges from tracking these inconsistencies carefully is not that Wiggum is secretly brilliant, it's that Wiggum is selectively incompetent. He is a man who knows, with precision and consistency, which cases he is not supposed to close. He has an internal map of Springfield's power structure not written down, not consciously formulated as a policy, but built through years of working in a town where the power structure is unmistakable once you have learned to read it. And he navigates that map by ensuring that his failures cluster reliably around the cases that matter to the people who keep him employed. The architecture of this is familiar from the study of corrupt municipal governance in real American cities. The key mechanism is not that the police chief is paid to fail. The mechanism is that the police chief was selected for the position because he can be relied upon not to succeed in ways that would be inconvenient, and he is maintained in the position because his continued maintenance serves the same people whose interests his selective failure serves. Nobody needs to give Wiggum specific instructions about which cases to lose. The selection process ensures that the person in the position has the right instincts. Who does this serve? Burns, whose plant's violations have never been connected to the town's health outcomes by any meaningful law enforcement investigation. Fat Tony, whose operations generate arrest statistics, the kind of low-level, peripheral arrests that create the appearance of active law enforcement without disrupting the core of the enterprise, without any serious engagement with the infrastructure of his criminal organization. Quimby, whose corruption is visible from significant distances, and whose continued political existence depends on a police department that maintains the appearance of function without the substance. Wiggum keeps all of them protected not through active corruption in the sense of taking specific bribes for specific outcomes, but through the more durable and more deniable mechanism of knowing where the edges are and staying inside them. Now, here is the complication that makes Wiggum something more than a simple instrument of the power structure. The complication is Ralph. Ralph Wiggum is one of the stranger children in Springfield, which, in a town full of unusual children, is a significant distinction. His grasp of conventional reality is tenuous in ways that the show plays for comedy, but that, taken seriously for a moment, suggest a child who is genuinely navigating the world through a significantly different cognitive framework than the one most people share. His observations are either non sequiturs or accidentally penetrating, and the show is sometimes deliberately ambiguous about which. He is not malicious. He is not cruel. He is simply elsewhere, in his own interior world, engaging with external reality on his own terms rather than on the terms the external world presents. In a town with the specific social ecology that Springfield has, being Ralph Wiggum without the protection of a powerful father would be genuinely difficult. The show's Springfield is not kind to weakness or difference. It is a place where the social dynamics are often zero-sum, where belonging is asserted through the exclusion of people who don't fit, where a child as singular as Ralph would be vulnerable in ways that could produce real damage. Wiggum loves Ralph with an unambiguous, uncalculated, completely genuine devotion that is the most authentic thing about him. It is present across every episode that brings the two of them together in any sustained way. When the show wants to locate the real person inside the corrupt comedic police chief, it goes to the scenes between Wiggum and Ralph, and in those scenes, the performance drops. The strategic non-noticing drops, the practiced incompetence drops, and there is a father worried, attentive in his imperfect way, trying hard to understand a son who is difficult to understand, who would do anything within his available power to protect the specific, fragile, irreplaceable person that Ralph is. Being chief of police in Springfield is a particular kind of power. Not the power to change the town. Wiggum has demonstrated no interest in changing the town, but the power to protect, to ensure that certain things don't happen to certain people. To be present in the community in a way that provides Ralph with a kind of standing and protection that Ralph's own capabilities cannot generate. Losing the chief's position would mean losing that protection. And everything the position requires, the strategic non-noticing, the cases that don't close, the arrests that don't result in charges, is the price of maintaining the protection that Ralph needs. This is how complicity usually works in practice. It is almost never simple venality. It is almost never purely about money or ambition or moral vacancy. It is almost always someone doing something wrong for reasons they can tell themselves, in the quiet of night when the performance isn't running, are about something they love. Wiggum tells himself it's about Ralph. He is probably not entirely wrong, which makes the moral situation more complicated and more human than any of the satirical depictions of his incompetence quite acknowledges. The Springfield Police Force is, by design, an institution that performs its functions selectively. The performance of function, the visible, comedic attempts at law enforcement that generate enough activity to maintain the appearance of an active institution, is real and is really performed. Wiggum genuinely tries. In the cases where trying doesn't interfere with anything important, he has good days, bad days, days where the sandwich in his hand is more interesting than the crime in front of him. But the cases that matter, the ones connected to the power structure, to Burns, to Fat Tony, to Quimby's finances, these don't close. They don't close with the consistency that, after enough time tracking it, is distinguishable from pure random incompetence. Random incompetence would close some of the important cases by accident. Wiggum's record is too clean. The cases that matter too consistently fail, while the cases that don't matter are resolved with enough regularity to maintain the institution's plausibility. That is not incompetence. That is a skill set that Springfield found a use for. Section 7. Apu Nahasapi Mapatilan Brilliance. Redirected by a system. Apu Nahasapi Mapetilan holds a doctorate from the Calcutta Institute of Technology. His dissertation was in quantum physics, work serious enough to have been completed at an institution of genuine scientific distinction. The field he was trained in the late 1980s and early 1990s when he would have been completing his degree, was actively absorbing talented people into university research programs, corporate research laboratories, and government scientific institutions. The credential he earned placed him, theoretically, in a labor market with multiple viable pathways toward a career that made full use of what he had studied. He works the register at a convenience store that is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at prices that are by his own admission significantly above market rate, selling products that have, on multiple occasions, been found to be past their expiration dates. The gap between the credential and the position is the most visible dimension of a story the show has been telling about Apu since his first appearance. A story about what happens when a system captures someone's circumstances and uses those circumstances to redirect their capabilities toward what the system needs rather than toward what the person is equipped for. The mechanism of capture, in Apu's case, is specific and historically grounded. He came to the United States for his doctorate. In the process of completing that doctorate, he overstayed his visa. He became an undocumented resident, a status that, in the period the show depicts, created significant constraints on legal employment in the formal economy, particularly in the kinds of credentialed positions that a PhD in physics would typically qualify for. Those positions required documentation. The pathways that Apu's credential had nominally opened were, in practical terms, blocked by the status that resulted from his decision to stay longer than his initial documentation permitted. The quick E-Mart was available, not because it was the right fit, not because working retail was a reasonable application of Apu's training, but because the Quick E-Mart, the corporation that runs the Quick E-Mart chain had, by the time Apu needed employment, developed a specific relationship with a specific kind of employee. The kind who is overqualified for the position, who has the intelligence and work ethic to manage the complexity of a small retail operation with close attention, and whose circumstances make them accept terms that a less constrained employee would not accept. The show has given us a face for the Quick E-Mart Corporation, a man living in elaborate comfort who meets franchise operators only in person at his headquarters, requiring international travel for the meeting. This is the portrait of someone who runs a franchise system at significant remove from the people that system employs, who has constructed terms and conditions that are managed through the franchise structure rather than through any direct relationship with individual operators. The terms, as visible through their effects on Apu's life, are extractive, extraordinary hours. Minimal staffing. Apu appears to have worked most of the available hours himself for much of the show's run. Prices set at the level the corporation determines, which happen to be above what market competition would produce in a normal commercial environment. Product standards that are flexible in ways that benefit the supplier relationships rather than the consumer experience. These are the terms of a franchise arrangement designed for operators whose alternatives are limited. An operator with full documentation and full access to the labor market would not accept these terms because they would not have to. Apu's circumstances removed that leverage. The franchise charged for it. What makes Apu's story more than a simple tale of exploitation is that Apu himself is not a passive figure within it. He is engaged, attentive, genuinely invested in the store and the community around it in ways that exceed any requirement of his employment. He knows his customers. He knows their histories, their families, their preferences, their situations. He has been in Springfield long enough to have relationships with multiple generations of the town's residents that go far beyond the commercial transaction of buyer and seller. This is the human element that complicates every structural analysis. The system captured Apu's circumstances and redirected his energy, but the human being within those circumstances built something real. The relationships, the community investment, the genuine care for the specific people who come through the Quick E-Mart's doors, these are not the products of the franchise system. They are the products of Apu, of who he is rather than what his situation required him to be. The story eventually evolves in ways that make the trap more complex. Apu's immigration status is resolved. He becomes a legal resident. He marries. He has 8 children, a single birth that the show uses for comedy, but which represents an enormous practical reality. He builds, across the years, a life in Springfield that is embedded in the community in ways that go far beyond the original commercial relationship. But the resolution of the immigration situation does not dissolve the trap. It transforms it. Because now Apu has 8 children, a wife, a home, a community, a life all in Springfield, all dependent on the continued operation of the Quick E-Mart, all rooted in the town that his original circumstances put him in. He cannot leave now even if he wanted to. The family he has built is rooted here. The business that supports the family is here. The community that has grown up around him across decades of daily interaction is here. This is the final, most complete form of the trap. The circumstances that originally constrained Apu have been replaced by a life that constrains him differently. The quick E-Mart was originally where he worked because he had no better option. Now it is where he works because it is the foundation of everything he has built. The original external constraint has been replaced by an internal one, by a life so thoroughly rooted in this specific place and this specific position that the constraint is now indistinguishable from belonging. Springfield does this. It builds lives around people until the lives themselves become the reason they stay. Apu came because he had no choice. He stays because he has built something. And somewhere between those two things, between the absence of choice and the presence of something built, the original question of whether the arrangement was good for him becomes genuinely difficult to answer. Too much has grown up around it. The PhD is still there, still in him. He does the quantum mechanics in his head when he needs to. The show has given us glimpses of this, the specific way his training surfaces in unexpected contexts. He is still, underneath everything that has grown up around the quick E-Mart position, the person his education produced. He is just producing something else with it now. Managing a convenience store at 2 in the morning in a town that needed him to manage a convenience store more than it needed another quantum physicist? Springfield got what it needed. Apu got Springfield. And the Quick E-Mart Corporation, somewhere in its calculations, recognized that this was a satisfactory outcome. Section 8. The Ned Flanders problem, the cost of doing everything right. Ned Flanders is, by any externally observable measure, the most virtuous person in Springfield. He is kind. He is generous. He is devout in a way that goes beyond social performance. He actually tries to live the way his faith tells him to live, applying religious principles to everyday decisions with a consistency that most self-described religious people do not manage in practice. He is an attentive and loving father. He is a faithful neighbor who helps even when the helping is thankless. He runs a business, the Leftorium, a left-handed product store that serves a population of people who are underserved by conventional retail and who appreciate the specific attention he brings to their needs. The Simpsons has repaid his virtue with the systematic destruction of almost everything he values. Let's go through it specifically, because the accumulation matters. Maud Flanders is dead. She has been dead since season 11. She was killed at a NASCAR event when Homer was dodging promotional t-shirts fired from a cannon, and the t-shirts redirected toward the bleachers where Maud was standing and knocked her from her seat. She fell. She died. Homer's instinctive, reflexive prioritization of his own comfort over any awareness of the people around him was the direct and proximate cause of her death. Ned forgave Homer. This forgiveness is presented in the show as a triumph of Ned's faith and character. And it is, in one reading, exactly that, an extraordinary demonstration of the capacity for grace that Ned's beliefs cultivate in him. But in another reading, it is something more complicated and more dark. Because the forgiveness did not require Homer to change. It absorbed the harm into Ned's interior without any corresponding accountability for the person who caused it. Homer, in the aftermath of Maud's death, experiences guilt in the episodic way that Homer experiences things intensely for a period and then not. He moves on. He continues being Homer. The man whose carelessness killed his neighbor's wife continues accepting his neighbor's help when that help is offered. Ned carries the weight, and the weight does not get lighter because he decided to forgive. His house was destroyed by a hurricane. The community rallied to rebuild it, a genuine expression of communal care, real enough in its intentions. But the rebuild was performed by people who meant well and built badly, and the result was structurally unsound and collapsed almost immediately after completion. This is a specific kind of loss that the show handles with more darkness than it usually allows. Not just the loss of the house, but the loss of the comfort that communal support should have provided. The discovery that even the care of people who mean well can be inadequate to the actual need. The isolation of being hurt by the very process that was supposed to help. This collapse triggered Ned's psychological breakdown, the episode in which, for the first and most sustained time in the show's run, the interior of Ned Flanders becomes visible. He screams at the town. He insults people by name, specifically, with observations that are accurate in ways that are uncomfortable precisely because they are accurate. He says things he has been absorbing and managing and converting into patience and grace for years. things that were always true but that his conditioning prevented him from saying. Springfield's response is to institutionalize him, not to hear him, not to acknowledge that his anger is justified. To remove him and place him somewhere, his anger can be professionally managed back into the acceptable form. The institution then reveals the origin of Ned's acceptable form. His parents, who the show depicts as beatniks of a particular early 1960s variety that managed to combine genuine counterculture commitment with comprehensive failure as parents, brought Ned to a psychiatrist when he was a child because he was uncontrollable. The psychiatrist conducted what the episode depicts as an extended behavioral modification process, years of work, specifically designed to convert Ned's natural aggression into the suppressed, cheerful, people-pleasing behavior that the adult Ned presents to the world. This revelation reframes everything. Ned's kindness, the thing that Springfield has always taken as a free resource, and that the show has used as the basis for dozens of jokes about the gap between virtue and reward, this kindness was manufactured. It was installed in a child who did not consent to having it installed. The niceness is not a character trait Ned chose. It is the residue of a therapeutic intervention that changed how he processes the world without his permission. Everything about Ned's adult life looks different once you know this. His patience with Homer is not saintliness. It is the conditioned response of a person whose brain was wired, as a child, to suppress the anger that Homer consistently generates in anyone who spends extended time with him. The forgiveness after Maude's death is not grace in the full sense of the word, because grace requires a genuine choice, and the conditioning has made the choice not fully free. When Ned forgives Homer, he is partly choosing to forgive, and partly enacting a response that was installed in him before he was old enough to have a say. The faith compounds this. Ned's religious belief is genuine. It is not a performance, not a social mask. He really believes, and the belief organizes his life in real ways. But the faith also serves a function that the show has gradually made visible. It is the framework that allows Ned to give meaning to a pattern of suffering that would, without that framework, be simply a pattern of arbitrary punishment for doing nothing wrong. If everything happens according to a divine plan, then the suffering has purpose. Then Maude's death is part of something larger that Ned cannot see but trusts is there. Then the hurricane and the collapsed house and the relationship with Homer and the decades of thankless generosity are all meaningful within a structure that transcends any individual calculus of fairness. Without the faith, what Ned has is this: a personality that was constructed without his consent, producing behavior that serves other people's comfort at the cost of his own authentic responses, being rewarded with suffering that has no apparent justification, in a community that takes the behavior and offers very little in return. The faith makes this bearable. But the show has been honest enough to let the faith be tested in ways that real faith is tested, not destroyed, not trivially overcome, but bent and strained and sometimes silenced by evidence that would justify very different conclusions. The most quietly devastating element of Ned's situation involves something the show never comments on directly, but which becomes visible when you hold the Ned storylines alongside the Homer storylines simultaneously. God speaks to Homer. This is established fact within the show's continuity. God has appeared, has taken a form, has engaged Homer in direct conversation on multiple occasions. Homer is not devout. He falls asleep in church. He treats religious obligations as social inconveniences to be minimized. His relationship with faith is, at best, occasional and self-interested. God does not speak to Ned, the man who has organized his entire adult life around his faith, who has applied religious principles to his daily behavior with a consistency and sincerity that is extraordinary, who has endured a pattern of suffering that a rigorous theology of divine providence would need to work hard to explain. That man has not received the divine attention that the show has extended to Homer without Homer seeking it. The drunk gets the conversation. The devout man gets the silence. The show does not comment on this. It simply allows it to exist as a fact of Springfield's universe. And the fact is devastating if you sit with it. It means that whatever logic governs who receives divine attention in this universe, it is not the logic of devotion or faith or effort or goodness. It is some other logic, a logic that seems, from the evidence, to have more to do with narrative centrality than with virtue. Homer is the protagonist. God talks to the protagonist. Ned is next door. Ned gets what people next door to protagonists get: proximity to the story's consequences without the story's protections. Springfield does not reward goodness. It does not punish it either, in any systematic way. It is simply indifferent to it, in the way that systems are indifferent to the qualities that do not affect their functioning. Ned's goodness does not make Springfield work better. It does not disrupt anything or challenge anything. It costs Springfield nothing and provides it with something a reliable source of help and forgiveness and neighborly support that the town consumes without accounting for. The conditioning that made Ned what he is was, in the most cynical reading, the most useful thing his parents ever did for Springfield. They produced a person who would give and give and forgive and never, under normal circumstances, present any claim for what the giving cost. The breakdown episode showed what happens when normal circumstances fail, and then the institution managed him back to normal, and Springfield went back to consuming what Ned provides, without once asking what it costs him to provide it. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that does not reward rightness. Homer Simpson is what happens when you do everything wrong in a system that does not punish wrongness. They live next door to each other. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years, and the gap between them, the gap between the man who tries and the man who does not, has never once closed. Because in Springfield, the gap does not close. The system is not designed to close it. Section 9. Bart's Dark Futures. What the flash-forwards are actually saying. The Simpsons has imagined Bart Simpson's adult life multiple times across its run, in flash-forward episodes that glimpse years or decades into the futures of the Simpson children. In anthology segments that experiment with who these characters might become if time were allowed to actually do what time does. In the occasional dark observation embedded in a regular episode about the specific trajectory that Bart's qualities, in combination with Springfield's environment, seem to point toward. These futures are officially non-binding. They are possibilities, what-ifs, speculations. The show always returns to the present. The characters go back to their regular ages. The possibilities close. But they were imagined by people who have spent decades understanding these characters deeply, and the specific futures they imagine for Bart, the ones they keep returning to, the ones that share consistent elements across different episodes and different writers, reveal something about what the show understands to be true about who Bart is and where that leads. The earliest sustained Bart flash-forward is in Bart to the Future, the 2000 episode that imagined a future in which Lisa becomes the first female president of the United States. Bart, in this future, is in his early 30s. He is nominally in a band, or has been in a band, or is in the process of reconstituting a band. The details resist specificity in ways that are themselves specific, the future the show imagines for Bart. At 32 is one in which the details of his life remain unclear and unresolved, because Bart himself has not committed to making them clear and resolved. He borrows money from President Lisa. He has a scheme, the way he always has a scheme. But the scheme is the kind of scheme that someone runs when they still believe that cleverness and improvisation are sufficient replacements for sustained effort and commitment. At 32, Bart is still running the approach to life that worked more or less in comedic terms at 10. The show presents this as gentle comedy. The joke is that Bart, freed from the regular show's reset mechanism, turns out to be exactly what his childhood suggested he might be, a charming, creative, perpetually barely managing adult who has found no application for his qualities that has produced anything stable. The comedy is gentle because the show still loves Bart, and the love means the depiction does not want to be cruel. But if you resist the comedy for a moment and sit with the specific portrait the show is drawing a man in his early 30s with no money, no stable home, no clear sense of what his life is building toward, borrowing from his younger sister who has become the most powerful person in the world, the portrait has edges to it that the comedy softens but does not remove. What happened between 10 and 32? The short answer is that Springfield happened. Springfield, which does not prepare its children for anything other than survival within Springfield's own specific ecology. Springfield, which rewards a certain kind of quick, reactive, situational intelligence and provides no model for the other kind, the sustained, goal-directed, delayed gratification intelligence that conventional success in the wider world tends to require. Springfield, which taught Bart to be excellent at the immediate situation and gave him nothing for the situation of his own long-arc life. Homer is partly responsible for this, but Homer is partly responsible in the way that all parents are partly responsible for the shapes their children grow into, not through malice or indifference, but through limitation. Homer has never modeled the thing Bart needs to learn. Homer's own approach to his life has been reactive and present tense in exactly the way that Bart's is. The pattern was there to be learned. Bart learned it, with the additional layer of intelligence that makes Bart sharper than Homer in most immediate situations and no better equipped for the long view. Future Drama, from 2005, gives a closer flash forward that is more emotionally honest about where this leads. Bart at 18, standing at the edge of adulthood with community college in front of him and Lisa's Yale scholarship as the frame of comparison. The scene where his girlfriend asks him what he wants his life to look like, and Bart cannot answer, not because he is stupid, not because he does not care, but because the question requires a kind of intentionality toward the future that Bart has simply never been given. The formation to generate is among the most quietly devastating in the flash-forward canon. He wants things to be good. He wants it to work out. But the specific texture of what good would look like, the steps between here and there, the sustained commitment that would need to characterize the passage from one to the other, this Bart cannot produce. It is not that he is incapable of caring. He cares. It is that caring and planning are different skills, and the second one was never cultivated. The girlfriend leaves. She leaves for someone who could tell her what his life was going to look like, someone with a plan. And the show holds the loss rather than cutting away from it. Holds Bart feeling the loss rather than immediately providing the comedy that would make the loss smaller. Because future drama is doing something the show is usually protected from doing by its own reset mechanism. It is letting the specific costs of Bart's approach to life accumulate visibly. Holidays of Future Past, from 2011, is the richest and most extended of the Bart flash-forwards. Here Bart is in his 40s. He has been married twice and is now divorced from both marriages. He has a son, Jiff, who is sullen and disconnected in ways that map almost precisely onto the disconnection in Bart's relationship with Homer. The generational transmission is the episode's most painful element. The specific ways Homer kept Bart at emotional distance, not from lack of love, but from the specific limitation of Homer's emotional vocabulary, the inability to say the things that would have reached Bart. The love that was present but not always fluent are now visible again in the relationship between Bart and Jiff. The limitation did not disappear between generations. It traveled. Homer loved Bart and could not always show it in the ways Bart needed. Bart loves Jiff and cannot always show it in the ways Jiff needs. The pattern is the same pattern. The wound is the same wound, wearing the faces of a different generation. The episode's final movement is the most important thing it does. It gives Bart and Jiff a moment of genuine connection, imperfect, awkward, incomplete but real. A breakthrough in the specific language of imperfect male emotional communication that the show knows intimately from decades of writing Homer and Bart. The moment is not resolved into a clean redemption. The show does not promise it will hold, does not tell you the pattern is broken, does not provide the cathartic endpoint that would make the episode feel resolved. It just gives you the moment, and lets it be what it is. This is the truest thing the Bart flash-forwards collectively say about him. Not that he fails, not that the trajectory is pure darkness with no exits, but that the specific qualities he carries, the intelligence, the heart, the improvisation, the resistance to being organized in ways that do not feel like his own, the genuine warmth that surfaces between the chaos, these produce a life that is more complicated than success and more interesting than simple failure. A life in which the things that were best about being Bart Simpson are still present, imperfectly deployed in an adult context that was never quite designed for them, still capable of moments of real connection despite the evidence suggesting he is better at the moments than at the sustained thing. What the flash-forwards collectively suggest about Bart's relationship to Springfield is something the show dramatizes without stating. Bart, in most of the futures the show imagines for him, stays near Springfield. He orbits back, not because he could not leave. Bart has left Springfield in various episodes, has demonstrated the capability to exist outside it, has shown no particular inability to function in other environments. But because Springfield is the world he understands, the one whose specific texture, the way authority works there, the way cleverness is valued there, the specific ecology of the town's social and economic dynamics is the texture his particular formation has equipped him for. He is Springfield's most authentic product. He was shaped by it completely, absorbed its specific lessons about how the world works with the comprehensive thoroughness that children absorb the world they grow up in, and carries those lessons into adulthood in ways that are both asset and liability. The adaptability, the reading of immediate situations, the comfort with chaos, the genuine warmth, these are Springfield's gifts to Bart. The lack of formation for the long arc, the difficulty sustaining commitment to things that do not provide immediate feedback, the approach to life's horizons as something to improvise toward rather than plan for, these are also Springfield's gifts to Bart. Of the less fortunate variety, the flash-forwards are the show's most honest accounting of those gifts, given without the reset mechanism that normally protects the characters from consequences. Given in the specific form of a man whose childhood you watched, now trying to be the adult that childhood produced. Still trying, still capable of the moments that made you love him. Still, unmistakably, Bart. Section 10. The writer's room knows more than their saying production history as evidence. The Simpsons is more than 36 years old. It is one of the longest-running creative enterprises in the history of American entertainment, and like any institution of that age and scale, it has a history that is not entirely visible in what appears on screen. The decisions made by real people in real rooms about a fictional town have, across those decades, accumulated into a record that is in some ways more revealing about what The Simpsons actually is as a cultural object, as a commercial property, as a creative institution than any individual episode. The production controversies that have surrounded the show over its run are not incidental to understanding it. They are, in their way, evidence of the same dynamics the show has been depicting in Springfield for decades. The way institutions manage their contributors. The way power structures maintain themselves. The way complicity gets constructed and maintained. The gap between what an institution says it is and what the pattern of its decisions shows it to be. The most genuinely irreversible loss in the show's production history is Phil Hartman. Phil Hartman joined The Simpsons in its first season and became, rapidly, one of its most structurally essential contributors. He voiced Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, two characters who were not simply beloved supporting players, but were load-bearing elements of the show's satirical architecture. Troy McClure was Springfield's entertainment industry given human form, the celebrity whose attachment to any project was simultaneously an endorsement and a warning, whose complete sincerity in the service of enterprises that deserved no sincerity was itself the joke and the comment. Lionel Hutz was Springfield's legal system, not a critique of incompetent lawyers in the abstract, but a specific, vivid portrait of what access to legal representation looks like when you can only afford what Springfield's market offers. Both characters worked because of Hartman specifically. The thing he brought to them, the specific quality of sincere investment in content that did not merit sincerity, the warmth that made characters who should have been contemptible into characters you found yourself almost caring about, despite knowing better, this was not transferable. It was his. The performances exist because Hartman existed, and they are unrepeatable because he was unrepeatable. Hartman was murdered in May 1998. He was 49 years old. The show's decision to retire both characters rather than recast them was the right decision. Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz belong to Hartman and to no one else. Any other performer doing those voices would not be doing those characters. They would be performing an approximation of the characters while evoking the person who created them. And the evocation would be the cruelest kind of reminder. The show understood this correctly and acted on it correctly. But the consequence is a Springfield that is permanently different from what it was before May 1998. The entertainment industry has no face. The legal system has no embodiment. The satirical functions those characters served have not been replaced because they were not replaceable. Something in Springfield's air changed that year. The show absorbed it and continued. But the absorption was not complete. The gap is still there for viewers who knew what those characters were. A permanent negative space in a show that has no clean way to acknowledge it. The Harry Shearer situation tells a different story, one about power and institutional management. In 2015, Shearer announced his departure from the show. He voices more central characters than any other cast member: Burns, Smithers, Skinner, Ned Flanders, Kent Brockman, Dr. Hibbert, and several others who populate Springfield's institutional infrastructure. His departure would have meant the loss of characters so central to the show's architecture that it is difficult to imagine the show functioning in the same way without them. The dispute was about contractual provisions regarding outside work, Shearer's ability to take on projects outside The Simpsons while continuing to work on The Simpsons. The details were negotiated publicly in ways unusual for television contract disputes, with positions stated through lawyers and to journalists, in a way that gave outside observers an unusual window into the dynamics of a 30-year-old institution defending its assets. Shearer eventually returned. The terms of the resolution were not made fully public. What the Shearer episode reveals is something about the institutional posture of the show at that point in its run. By 2015, The Simpsons had been on the air for 26 years and had accumulated a commercial value that made it a significant asset in its corporate parent's portfolio. Institutions of that value and that age develop strong preferences for stability and predictability. They develop standardized responses to contributors whose individual circumstances or desires might introduce instability. The management of those contributors, ensuring their continued participation on terms the institution finds acceptable, becomes a distinct institutional function that sometimes operates at cross purposes with the specific human interests of the people being managed. This dynamic is not unique to The Simpsons. It is visible in the history of every long-running creative franchise. But The Simpsons has a specific relationship with this dynamic that makes it worth noting. The show that created Springfield, that has spent decades satirizing exactly this kind of institutional management of human beings, had itself become an institution that managed its contributors in similar ways. The show about Burns managing Homer had become, in certain structural respects, something that Burns might recognize. The predictions phenomenon is the final production story worth considering, and from the production angle it looks different than it does from the fan angle. The show has been credited with an extraordinary number of accurate anticipations of real events. The Trump presidency, the Disney-Fox merger, technological developments, specific incidents. The list is documented extensively and discussed extensively. And the fan response, the sense that something prophetic or conspiratorial is happening, is understandable. The coincidences are specific enough, in certain cases, that simple luck feels inadequate as an explanation. The production angle is this. The Simpsons writers' room at its peak was one of the most intellectually distinguished in the history of American television. Writers with genuine hard science backgrounds, with degrees in mathematics and political science and economics, with training in exactly the kinds of analytical frameworks that distinguish careful observation from random speculation. People who had spent their careers studying how systems work and where they tend to go. When these people wrote a joke about a Trump presidency in the year 2000, they were not guessing randomly. They were observing that Trump had been publicly flirting with political ambition since the late 1980s. They were observing that the trajectory of celebrity in American political culture was moving in a specific direction. They were observing that the entertainment industry's relationship to political authority had been changing in ways that were making what would previously have seemed absurd increasingly plausible. They took those observations and extrapolated them to their logical conclusion, exaggerated for satirical effect. 16 years later, the extrapolation arrived. This is not prophecy. This is what sustained, careful, honest attention to the present looks like when it is performed by people who are very good at it. The predictions are evidence of the analytical intelligence that the show's best writers brought to their work. There is also the simpler statistical reality. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, references, and satirical observations about American culture, technology, politics, and society. When you generate that much content over that long a period, some of it is going to align with future events through sheer volume. The predictions that came true are the ones people remember and share. The predictions that did not come true, the jetpacks, the moon colonies, the political outcomes that went other directions are not shared, not screenshotted, not built into conspiracy theories. The confirmation bias runs in one direction, and the highlight reel it produces looks more prophetic than the complete record would. But that explanation, while accurate, does not quite dissolve the uncanny feeling when a specific clip from 1997 aligns precisely with a specific headline from 2025. Because even understanding how the trick works, the trick is still impressive to watch. The show that wrote Springfield has spent 36 years observing America carefully enough to occasionally see where America was going before America got there. That is not supernatural. It is craft. It is the specific craft of a group of writers who paid closer attention to the world than most people do, who understood the mechanisms of the culture they were satirizing well enough to sketch its trajectories, and who had the volume of output and the years of production to ensure that enough of those sketches would eventually line up with the world they described. The writer's room knows more than they're saying because good satirists always do. They see the structure behind the surface. They understand the system well enough to predict its behavior. And they put what they see into jokes, because jokes are what the format requires, and because sometimes a joke is the only form in which certain truths can be said without being dismissed immediately. Springfield is the joke. And 36 years later, the joke keeps being true. Conclusion. What keeps us coming back? It has been a long night in Springfield. We have traced the architecture of Sector 7G and found a system designed, with precision and care, to fail in specific and profitable and legally defensible ways. We have mapped the shadow government that actually runs the town, Burns controlling the formal institutions, Fat Tony managing the informal economy, Quimby serving as the public face of an arrangement with nothing to do with public service. We have asked whether the horror that plays out every October in the Treehouse episodes really stays contained by the non-canon label, or whether something bleeds through into the regular continuity in ways the label was never quite designed to prevent. We have watched Sideshow Bob fail to kill Bart for 30 years, and concluded that failing might be the actual point, that the conflict is what Bob is building his life around, and that winning would be the worst possible outcome for a man who has organized everything he values around the relationship the conflict provides. We have stood in Krusty's makeup chair before anyone else arrives and seen the man behind the paint who is still, after all these years, looking for something the paint has never been able to give him. We have looked at Chief Wiggum and found something more complicated than a buffoon, a man who knows which cases he is not supposed to close, who stays in a job whose requirements he understands clearly because the position protects someone he loves. We have stood at the Quick E-Mart counter with Apu and thought about what it means that a PhD in quantum physics is here at 2 in the morning, checking expiration dates. We have stood in Ned's yard and thought carefully about what it costs to be the good man in a town that takes goodness as a free resource. We have read the futures the show imagines for Bart and found them sadder and more hopeful than any individual episode makes fully explicit. And we have looked at the show itself, the real institution, the production history, the real people making real decisions about a fictional town, and found Springfield there too, doing what Springfield does. After all of that, what remains is the question the show has always generated but never quite answered. Why can we not leave? Not Springfield's residents, who have their specific reasons, the economics, the deals made by their fathers, the lives that have grown around them like trees around fence posts, until they cannot tell the difference between the fence post and themselves. But us. The people watching. The people who have been watching for decades. Who can articulate the decline from whatever golden era they personally located in. Who know the flaws. Who have theories. Who have spent more time thinking about this cartoon town than they have spent thinking about some actual places they have lived. Why do we keep coming back to Springfield? The honest answer is that Springfield showed us something true when we first encountered it. Something true about how families work, not idealized families, but actual families, in which love and frustration and forgiveness and resentment all coexist in the same house, without resolving into any one of them permanently. Something true about how communities function, not idealized communities, but actual ones, in which collective denial and shared convenient fictions are as much a part of the social fabric as genuine solidarity. Something true about how power operates not in the dramatic, visible way of villains and heroes, but in the structural, invisible way of systems that manage human behavior through dependency and the careful manipulation of available alternatives. These things were true when the show began. Some version of them is still true, and something in us recognizes them, across all the years and all the changes and all the accumulated distance from wherever we first watched the opening credits, as recognizable, as a version of things we know. The theories in this video exist because some people looked at Springfield and decided not to accept the surface as complete. They paid attention. They connected things. They asked why Homer keeps his job, why Wiggum never closes certain cases, why the treehouse feels like it bleeds through sometimes, why Bob keeps failing in ways that seem like they might be choices. And what they found, when they looked what all the theories collectively point toward, is a version of Springfield that has been built with more care than its reputation, as a simple comedy suggests. The show has been telling you something for 36 years, not shouting it, not making it impossible to miss. Telling it in the way a good long conversation tells you things, through accumulation, through pattern, through the specific weight that certain images and certain moments carry when you pay enough attention to them over enough time. The nuclear plant is the cause of everything, or Homer has been dreaming since 1993, or the town maintains its impossible reality through collective denial and the exile of truth-tellers, or Burns has engineered the entire arrangement, or the writers knew more than they were saying, and the knowing is visible in the texture of the work. The theories disagree about the mechanism. They agree about the conclusion. Something is constructed in Springfield. Something deliberate and specific and more interesting than a cartoon should be able to contain. And whatever that something is, it is worth the attention. It has been worth the attention all along. The couch gag is playing, the family assembles. The episode begins. The same as it always is. And different, now that you have been looking at it this way. Springfield is still down there. The same yellow faces, the same familiar skyline, the same cracked cooling towers in the distance, the same Wiggum eating his sandwich, the same fat Tony at his restaurant, the same Apu at his counter, the same Krusty with his makeup on, the same Ned at his fence, waving to the neighbor who never quite deserves the wave. And Homer, coming home. We watch him come home. We have always watched him come home. And whatever else is true about Springfield, whatever is real and whatever is dreamed and whatever is constructed and whatever is genuinely mysterious, that part is real. Homer comes home. The family is there. Something imperfect and alive and full of love that does not always know what to do with itself. That is what we come back for. That is what we have always come back for. Good night, Springfield. Sleep well. Thank you for watching. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, you made it to the end, and that means something. Springfield will be there when you wake up. It always is. Supplemental. The Sector 7G Conspiracy Extended Analysis. There's a particular kind of story that keeps getting told about Homer Simpson, and it goes like this. He is a lovable disaster, a man whose heart is enormous and whose brain is insufficient, who stumbles through disasters he causes and lands on the other side of them, still upright, still loved, still surrounded by the family that somehow tolerates him. This story is not wrong exactly, but it is a frame, and what frames do is direct your attention towards certain things and away from others. The frame of the lovable disaster directs you away from the question of design. If Homer is a disaster, you do not ask who built the disaster, who benefits from it, why the disaster has persisted at this specific post for this specific duration with this specific pattern of failures. The show's early seasons have a specificity about Homer's workplace that later seasons sometimes smooth over in favor of broader comedy, and the early specificity is worth returning to because the early seasons were written by people who had not yet replaced close observation with familiar shorthand. In the early seasons, Homer's incompetence at work is portrayed with enough detail that you can see exactly what it consists of. Not general stupidity applied to a job he happened to have, but specific, pattern failures that cluster around the functions most likely to surface the plant's violations. His drowsiness is worst at the console. His inattention is sharpest when the instruments are active. His appetite for donuts is most intense during the specific windows when something in the facility's operational status would, in a competently staffed environment, be receiving human attention. This clustering is subtle. The show never annotates it. You would not notice it across individual episodes unless you were watching for it. But it is there, and when you notice it, the interpretation available to you is different from the interpretation the frame of lovable disaster provides. Burns has known Homer since Homer was a child. This is established in the Mona Simpson episodes, and it is more important than it might seem at first. Burns did not hire Homer as a young adult without context. Burns hired Homer with a century of intelligence gathering about Springfield and its residents, with specific knowledge of the Simpson family history, knowledge that he personally shaped by having Mona driven out, and with a very clear sense of what the adult Homer would be like based on what the childhood Homer was like. In the wake of that absence, a man who has been watching a town for a century develops a particular kind of knowledge. He knows who the resilient ones are and who the fragile ones are. He knows who can be trusted to remain loyal through threat and who will fold. He knows whose psychology has been shaped in ways that make them useful and whose has been shaped in ways that make them inconvenient. He knows these things not because he has studied them academically, but because he has lived among them and used this knowledge operationally across enough iterations to understand it at a level deeper than articulation. When Burns looks at Homer Simpson, he is not looking at an individual in isolation. He is looking at the product of 30 years of parental absence, of a specific emotional wound that produces a specific adult psychology, of a cognitive limitation that has a traceable physical cause, of an economic dependency that keeps the adult in place, of a family structure that provides enough that leaving would feel like loss, but not so much that a different arrangement could be easily imagined. Burns sees all of this because Burns has been watching this type of person get produced by Springfield's conditions for longer than Homer has been alive. And Burns deploys it with the practiced ease of someone who has been deploying it for a long time against people who had no idea the deployment was happening. The specific detail of the German investor's near bankruptcy deserves more attention than it usually gets in discussions of Homer's employment. When the Germans run the cost estimate for compliance, the number they receive is not merely high. It is civilization scale. It is the kind of number that suggests the plant's violations are not the violations of a facility that has been cutting corners for a decade or two. They are the violations of a facility that has never been in compliance, that was built without compliance in mind, that has been generating value for its owner by externalizing costs, the health costs, the environmental costs, the long-term community costs onto the population of Springfield rather than paying them. This is the structure of a very specific kind of profitable enterprise, one that makes money by converting public resources and public health into private value without accounting for what the conversion costs. The plant's profitability depends entirely on the violations remaining unaddressed. Fix the violations and the plant is not profitable. The plant's entire business model is the violations. Homer is not a cost to this business model. Homer is a protected component of it. Every donut he eats at his console is Burns's return on the investment he made when he arranged for Homer to be in that seat. Every meltdown warning Homer sleeps through is the yield on the deal with Grandpa Simpson. Every report that does not get written, every connection that does not get made, every question that does not get asked, these are the dividends on Burns's long-term management of the Simpson family situation. The Season 12 Crayon episode does something the show rarely does. It lets us see what the counterfactual looks like. Smart Homer is not a fantasy version of Homer. He is the person Homer would have been if the crayon had never been in his skull, if Burns had not driven Mona away, if the psychology of maternal abandonment had not shaped him in the specific ways it did. Smart Homer is the version of Homer who had the full use of his faculties and the full formation of his emotional history. And that Homer does exactly what Burns feared he would do. He goes to work, he looks at the instruments, he makes connections, he writes the report, he does his job. The job that Burns needed him to not do. The key moment in the episode is the one where Smart Homer's intelligence is directly threatened, where Burns makes it clear, through the precise application of pressure to the precise vulnerabilities that remain even when Homer is smart, that being the person who sees clearly is incompatible with having the things Homer needs to have. The job, the family, the stability, the sense of belonging that every moment of Homer's psychology, shaped by a mother's absence and a father's deal with the devil, has been oriented around acquiring and maintaining. Smart Homer makes the calculation that the show lets be genuinely tragic. He decides that being able to see clearly is not worth the cost of seeing clearly. He decides that the fog is preferable to the light, and he has the crayon put back in. This choice is important because it is genuinely his choice. Burns did not force him. Burns did not physically intervene. Burns applied the social and economic pressure that the system makes available to him, and Homer chose retreat over confrontation. And in doing so, Homer chose the system. He made himself complicit in his own management. Not out of stupidity he was making the choice as the smartest version of himself, but out of an accurate assessment of what resistance would cost. This is the thing that makes the Sector 7G story not simply about exploitation, but about something closer to tragedy. Homer is not simply a victim of Burns's system. He is someone who understood the system clearly enough, in one brief window, to see exactly what it was doing to him, and chose to ununderstand it rather than face the consequences of understanding. The crayon going back in is not Burns winning over Homer. It is Homer deciding with full awareness that winning is too expensive. Burns's victory is complete not because he imposed it, but because Homer accepted it freely. And that is a different and darker kind of victory than the one the show's comedy suggests is happening. The question the show never quite asks is what would happen if Homer stayed smart. Not in the episode's terms, not what would happen to his personal relationships within the episode, but what would happen to the plant, to Springfield, to the specific arrangement that Burns has been maintaining for 30-plus years. If Homer filed the report, if the regulatory agencies received it, If the violations were formally documented by someone whose documentation was legally significant, what would Burns do? The show does not answer this because the show does not let smart Homer persist long enough to find out. But the speed and the precision of Burns's response suggests he has an answer ready. Burns is not improvising when he applies pressure to smart Homer. He is executing a prepared response to a contingency he identified as possible and planned for. The preparation means he has thought through what comes next. The next step in the containment protocol. The next layer of the arrangement. Whatever it is that happens if Homer persists. We never find out what it is. Homer chooses not to persist. And the arrangement continues, as it always continues, because every component of the system is calibrated to ensure its own continuation. 700 errors, 30 years. One nuclear plant. One very old man who never forgets what Homer's continued incompetence is worth. And one Homer Simpson, who found out what it would cost to be otherwise and chose to come home to Evergreen Terrace instead. Supplemental. Marge's complicity and the marriage as system. There is an element of the Homer arrangement that the show consistently places in the frame and consistently declines to examine directly, which is Marge Simpson's full knowledge of what Homer is and what Homer does, and what Homer's continued presence in Sector 7G means for their family's economic security. Marge is not stupid. The show has given us, across 36 seasons, ample evidence that Marge is the most competent person in the Simpson household by a significant margin, that she is the emotional manager of the family, the logistical planner, the person who maintains the household's actual function against the continuous background noise of Homer's disasters. She is also the person who, more than anyone else in Homer's immediate world, sees him clearly. She has been with him long enough to understand the pattern of his behavior, the specific texture of his limitations, the exact nature of what he can and cannot do. She knows he is not good at his job. She knows the plant has problems. She has known these things for decades, and she has not acted on them. Not because she is complicit in Burns's arrangement in any formal sense, but because she is complicit in the same way that every member of a family is complicit in the arrangements that keep the family functioning. The job is the income. The income is the house. The house is the children's stability. Every piece of this is downstream of Homer remaining employed at the plant, and Marge has spent 30 years managing the family in a way that requires the income to keep coming. She has made an accommodation. The accommodation is not spoken. It is not acknowledged. It exists in the form of all the questions she does not ask about what Homer does at work, all the moments when the plant is in the news for some new violation or some new incident, and Marge redirects the family's attention towards something else. All the evenings when Homer comes home smelling of reactor coolant and Marge makes dinner. The accommodation has a cost. The cost is that Marge has organized her life around keeping the arrangement going, which means she has organized her life around the arrangement. She is not free of it. She is, in a practical sense, one of its most essential components. Her management of the household, her patience with Homer, her ability to keep the family stable despite Homer's comprehensive instability as a partner, all of this is part of what makes the arrangement possible. Without Marge, Homer cannot function at the level required to maintain even the minimal functionality his employment requires. The donuts make it through the day because Marge made sure Homer had breakfast. The console gets attended at some point during the shift because Marge made sure Homer left the house on time. The family is there when Homer comes home, providing the sense of having something to come home to that is one of the few genuine motivators in Homer's emotional life. Marge holds the arrangement together from the domestic side. Burns holds it together from the institutional side. And Homer lives inside the space their combined maintenance creates, experiencing his life as his own in the way that people inside stable systems always experience their lives as their own, without seeing the structure that makes the stability possible. This is not a condemnation of Marge. It is an observation about what marriage inside a system looks like from the inside. The system that Burns built around Homer did not stop at the factory door. It extends all the way to Evergreen Terrace, into the kitchen, into the patience that Marge deploys every evening when Homer comes home. Burns built Homer into the arrangement. Life built Marge into it around him. And somehow, despite all of this, there is genuine love in it. The specific, improbable, infuriating, sustaining love of two people who have spent 30 years being each other's primary reality. The love is not manufactured by the arrangement. It exists alongside the arrangement, in the spaces the arrangement doesn't quite fill. in the moments when the system recedes and two people who chose each other are just choosing each other again. That is what makes Springfield livable. Not the system. The love that happens inside the system, in spite of it, without quite managing to dismantle it. The arrangement keeps running. The love keeps running alongside it. And at 742 Evergreen Terrace, these two things coexist in the specific, particular, unrepeatable way that they always have. Supplemental: Burns's immortality and the medical infrastructure of power. We have talked about Burns in the context of Homer's employment. But Burns deserves his own extended consideration, because what the show has built around Burns across 36 seasons is something considerably more elaborate and more interesting than a simple villain. Burns is, by the most conservative estimate that the show's continuity supports, well over 100 years old. He has referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has told stories about events from the 1910s as though he experienced them firsthand. He has described working relationships with historical figures who died before most of the show's audience was born. He served in World War II, though his role was morally questionable at best. He knew Howard Hughes. He attended Yale. He was present at events that people living today encounter as history, and he encountered them as present tense. And he is still here, still running the plant, still conducting the schemes, still, in every episode where he appears, demonstrating the cognitive sharpness of someone who has not lost a step, whose strategic intelligence is as precise as it has apparently always been, whose ability to understand and manipulate the dynamics of any situation he finds himself in has been refined by a century of practice into something extraordinary. This is impossible. No human being maintains this into the second century of their life. No biological system persists this long without catastrophic degradation. The body burns out. The neurons misfire and then stop firing. The cellular maintenance mechanisms fail, and the failures accumulate until the accumulation is unmanageable. This is how humans end. This is how everyone ends. Except Burns. The show addresses this directly, and the answer it provides is worth taking seriously even though the show presents it as a throwaway joke. In the Springfield Files, it is established that Burns undergoes a weekly medical regimen so intensive, so loaded with chemicals and radiation therapy, that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. The treatments keep him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without the next treatment, he dies. The margin is 0. His life is maintained the way you maintain a machine, through scheduled servicing, through the regular delivery of specific inputs without which the system shuts down. The treatment involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's environment for decades, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his own biological functions. This is not a coincidence. This is a closed loop. The plant poisons the town, and the town's pollution poisons the plant's owner, and the owner manages his poisoning through a medical protocol that requires the specific resources that only his wealth can provide. Burns is not surviving through natural biological processes. He is being maintained artificially, through a weekly intervention that is administered on a precise schedule by people who understand what it involves and what would happen without it. Smithers is the key to this. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. Smithers ensures Burns makes every weekly appointment. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with the vigilance that borders on obsession and that the show has consistently depicted as one of the central features of their relationship. The show's surface reading of Smithers is that he is devoted to Burns in a way that has romantic overtones, that his attentiveness and his loyalty come from some form of love, complicated and unrequited and expressed through service. And that reading is not wrong. But there is another layer underneath it. Smithers is the only person who fully understands how Burns's medical protocol works. He is the only person who knows what the weekly treatments consist of, when they need to happen, what would happen if they were missed. His devotion to Burns is not simply emotional, it is logistical. He is keeping Burns alive through the management of a precise schedule, and he knows this, and the knowing is the foundation of their relationship. If Smithers ever truly left, walked away, made himself unavailable, Burns would miss a treatment. The equilibrium that the treatments maintain would collapse. And whatever happens when that equilibrium collapses, it happens within a week. Smithers is not devoted to Burns out of love alone, though the love is real. He is devoted because he understands, at a level he probably does not articulate even to himself, that his absence is a death sentence. He has made himself indispensable in the most literal sense, indispensable to the continuation of a life. Burns's relationship with historical events adds another layer. The show has depicted Burns interacting with or referencing an absurd number of historical moments, and the interaction is always personal rather than historical. He does not know about World War II the way people who were born after it know about it. He knows about it the way people who were in it know about it, with the specific texture of personal experience, with the kinds of details that don't appear in books, with the emotional weight of someone who was there. This means Burns has been alive long enough to watch entire historical epochs begin, develop, and conclude. He watched the industrial age transform into the information age. He watched the political structures of the early 20th century collapse and be replaced by the structures of the later 20th century. He watched technologies that were science fiction become commonplace. He watched generations of the people around him grow old and die while he remained. What does that do to a person? The show does not spend much time on this question, because the show's primary relationship to Burns is satirical, and the satirical function requires him to remain recognizable as a type rather than fully individuated as a person. But the question is there in the background of every Burns episode. What is it like to be the only person in the room who was alive when everything the room takes for granted was new? Burns's coldness makes a different kind of sense if you consider it from this angle. Not the coldness of someone who was born without warmth, but the coldness of someone who has watched enough people he might have cared about grow old and die. That caring has become a risk calculation rather than an instinct. He has outlasted everything. He has outlasted people and institutions and entire social arrangements. He has outlasted regimes and corporations and the cultural moments that defined specific eras. The thing that made him Burns at the beginning of his long life has persisted across everything that has ended around him, and the persistence required something. What it required, the show suggests, is this: the capacity to maintain the infrastructure of his own continuation as the primary project, the thing that every other project serves. The wealth is not an end. The power is not an end. The plant is not an end. These are all components of the system that keeps the treatments available, that keeps Smithers employed, that keeps the machinery of Burns's continuation running. The goal is continuation. Everything else is means. This gives Burns's relationship to Springfield a quality that is different from simple exploitation. He does not exploit Springfield because he enjoys it, or because he is indifferent to the people in it. He exploits Springfield because Springfield is the resource that makes the continuation possible. The people who live there, the community they constitute, the economy they participate in, all of it is fuel for the machine that keeps Burns alive. He could not have a different relationship to it and still be alive. The relationship is not incidental to who he is. It is constitutive. Remove the exploitation and there is no Burns, because the exploitation is what maintains the conditions under which Burns persists. The town, meanwhile, depends on Burns the way the arrangement depends on him continuing to maintain it. The plant is Springfield's primary employer. The plant is Springfield's primary power source. The plant is the center of the economic ecosystem that everything else in the town is either directly or indirectly dependent on. Burns cannot die without everything downstream of him collapsing. Springfield cannot exist without Burns. Burns cannot exist without Springfield. It is the arrangement the show will never fully articulate, because articulating it would mean acknowledging that the exploitation is mutual, that Springfield is complicit in its own condition, that the town and its oldest resident have built a system of mutual dependency so thorough that neither of them could walk away from it even if they wanted to. Burns does not want to. He has never wanted to. He has spent a century building this. And Springfield wakes up every morning to the glow of the cracked cooling towers and goes to work at the plant and drinks the water and does not ask why the fish in the river sometimes have extra eyes, because some questions once asked cannot be unasked. And Springfield has decided, collectively and quietly, that it is better not to ask. Supplemental: Lisa Simpson and the problem of clarity. Everything we have been discussing tonight has a witness. Someone who has been watching the arrangements and the systems and the patterns for 36 years without losing the capacity to see them for what they are. Someone who has not been broken in the way Homer has been broken, conditioned in the way Ned has been conditioned, captured in the way Apu has been captured. Someone who sees Springfield with a clarity that the town itself cannot accommodate. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old. She has been 8 years old for 36 years. She is, within the show's universe, the most intelligent member of the Simpson family, and arguably one of the most intelligent people in Springfield. Her IQ has been tested, in various episodes, at levels that exceed the upper bounds of what standardized testing can reliably measure. She plays the saxophone with genuine skill and genuine emotional depth. She has read more widely than anyone else in her household and most of the adults she knows. She is drawn, instinctively and persistently, toward the questions that nobody around her wants to engage with, the questions about justice and about honesty and about why things are the way they are rather than the way they should be. Springfield's relationship with Lisa's intelligence is the same relationship Springfield has with every uncomfortable truth. It acknowledges the truth when ignoring it is too inconvenient, and then forgets it as quickly as possible. The specific texture of Lisa's situation, the one the show returns to across its best episodes involving her, is not simply that she is smart in a dumb town. It is that her intelligence sees the town's dynamics clearly enough that living in the town with clear sight is a particular kind of pain. She can see what Burns is doing. She can see what the plant means for Springfield's health. She can see that the arrangements that keep things stable are the same arrangements that prevent anything from being better. She can see it all, and she is 8 years old, and she does not have the power to change any of it. And this gap between perception and agency is the central fact of Lisa's Springfield existence. The show has been honest about what this costs her. The episodes that take Lisa's inner life seriously, that do not use her intelligence as a punchline, that treat her perception of Springfield as the accurate perception it is, rather than as the cute over-seriousness of a child who will grow up. Eventually, these episodes consistently find the same thing underneath the intelligence, a loneliness that is produced by seeing clearly in a community that has organized itself around not seeing clearly. An isolation that comes from caring about things that the community has collectively decided not to care about. A persistent sense of being not quite right for the world she has been given. In the flash-forward episodes, the adult Lisa has usually managed to extract herself from Springfield to environments more suited to her specific qualities. She has become the politician or the professor or the accomplished person that her intelligence pointed toward. But the extraction has a cost, and the cost is the family. To be the adult Lisa she could be, she had to leave behind the child Lisa she was, had to leave behind the specific world that, for all its dysfunction, was the world where the people she loves most lived and where the specific warmth of her childhood was located. This is the version of Lisa's story that the flash-forwards keep gesturing at without quite making explicit. The intelligence that saves her from Springfield also takes her away from it. What you gain and what you lose are the same thing expressed differently. And the regular show, which cannot let her grow up, cannot let her leave, keeps Lisa at 8 years old in Springfield forever. It preserves her in the moment before the choice has to be made, before she has to decide what to become and what to leave behind. In the eternal present of Springfield, Lisa never has to choose. She can remain the brilliant child in the town that doesn't deserve her, perpetually on the edge of escaping, perpetually still there. This is its own kind of mercy and its own kind of cruelty. Springfield keeps her the way it keeps everything else. Preserved, unchanged, circling forever in the moment before things could be different. She still plays the saxophone every evening. The music reaches up through the window and out into the Springfield night. And somewhere in the distance the plant hums, and Burns sits in his office with his green glow, and Homer is asleep on the couch, and Maggie is watching everything. And Lisa plays. Because the music is the one thing she has that Springfield cannot co-opt, cannot use for its purposes, cannot redirect toward what the arrangement needs. The music is hers, just hers. In a town where almost everything belongs to something else, that matters more than it should have to. Supplemental. What the guest stars are actually telling you. The Simpsons has had more celebrity guest appearances than any other show in television history, by a significant margin. Presidents and rock stars and athletes and actors and authors and scientists and politicians and activists and cultural figures from every imaginable field have passed through Springfield across 36 seasons, encountered the Simpson family, and moved on. The standard reading of the guest star phenomenon is that it is a feature of the show's cultural centrality that appearing on The Simpsons, at least in the show's golden era, was understood as a significant cultural credential, and that the show's creative team used the appearances to both honor and satirize the figures who showed up. There is truth in this. The show's best guest appearances are genuinely interesting deployments of specific people in ways that use their actual qualities, their public personas, their known attributes, the specific texture of their cultural presence, rather than simply inserting a famous face into a plot that does not require them. But the coma theory illuminates the guest star phenomenon differently, and the illumination is worth sitting with. If Homer has been dreaming since April 1993, then every guest who appears in an episode from that point forward is not actually a guest. They are a character in Homer's dream. They are faces and names that Homer's unconscious mind has absorbed from the ambient world of the hospital room, the television playing in the background, the conversations of visitors and staff, the fragments of news and entertainment that reach him through the fog of unconsciousness, and incorporated into the dream narrative. This reading explains something that the guest star phenomenon has always raised as a question, but never answered. Why do the celebrities always end up in Springfield? The town is not a famous destination. It is not a place that famous people would naturally find themselves visiting. And yet musicians play concerts there, athletes compete there, politicians campaign there, scientists collaborate there. The town attracts cultural significance from outside itself at a rate that no real town with Springfield's characteristics would. In the coma theory, this makes perfect sense. Homer's dreaming brain is not constrained by the logic of why a famous person would visit a specific town. It is operating by the logic of dreams, which is the logic of what the sleeping mind encounters and processes. Homer hears a name on the hospital television. He hears a song. He hears a voice in a conversation between staff members. And his brain incorporates these fragments into the dream, gives them faces and dialogue and plot function, and they become the guests. Not real people visiting a real town, but pieces of Homer's ambient consciousness being woven into the narrative his mind is constructing. The later seasons have significantly more celebrity appearances than the earlier seasons, and this is usually explained in terms of the show's cultural prominence, that as the show became more established, more famous people were willing and eager to appear. But in the coma theory, the escalation has a different explanation. The later seasons are the deeper years of the coma, the years when Homer's brain has been unconscious longest and has been absorbing ambient material for longer and has less of its own generative capacity remaining and so relies more heavily on the incorporated fragments. The celebrities flood in not because Springfield became more famous, but because Homer's dreaming mind became more dependent on outside input as its own resources depleted. This is darker than the surface reading. It means the progression of the show's celebrity appearances tracks the progression of Homer's neurological deterioration. The more famous guests there are, the further we are from Homer's waking life, the more his mind is running on borrowed fragments rather than on its own creative depth. Whether or not you accept the coma theory, this reading produces an interpretive frame that makes the later season celebrity abundance into a symptom rather than just a feature. The symptom of a show that has, over time, replaced its original creative depth with the reliable energy of recognizable faces. The celebrities provide life to episodes that might otherwise feel somewhat empty, the warmth of recognition, the pleasure of seeing someone famous in an unexpected context, the guaranteed engagement that a known name produces. Homer's brain, in the coma theory, is doing exactly the same thing the show's production is doing in the later seasons, running on input rather than on invention. Making a noise that sounds like creativity using materials that someone else provided? This is not a condemnation, it is a description. And the description maps, with uncomfortable precision, onto the experience that viewers who have followed the show from its earliest seasons report when they talk about how the show has changed. Something changed. The show kept going. And the exact nature of what changed is very difficult to pin down except by the sense that the thing you were watching in the early seasons had a different quality from what you are watching now, a quality that is difficult to name but unmistakable once you have experienced it. The coma theory names it, not as a production failure, as a neurological event, as the thing that happens when a mind goes under and stays under and keeps dreaming because it does not know how to stop. Supplemental. The town that cannot remember Springfield's collective amnesia. There is a recurring phenomenon in The Simpsons that the show never directly addresses and that viewers have been grappling with since the early seasons. Springfield experiences things, enormous things, things that, in a realistic story about a real community, would permanently alter the town's character and the residents' relationship to their own history. Burns blocks out the sun. The town is sealed under a government-mandated dome. Significant portions of it are destroyed and rebuilt. The residents experience episodes of collective crisis, of civic confrontation, of moments where the underlying tensions of the place erupt visibly and force a reckoning. And then, the next episode begins, and nothing has changed. The crisis is not referenced. The reckoning did not produce any lasting change. The sun is back because it was always going to come back. The dome is gone without explanation. The rebuilt sections look exactly like the sections that were destroyed. The town does not remember, because the town has no mechanism for carrying memory forward in ways that would require confronting what the memories contain. Fans call this episodic storytelling. Writers and critics call it a limitation of the format, a necessary feature of a long-running series that cannot sustain continuity across hundreds of episodes without becoming unmanageable. And both of these things are true in the production sense. But within the logic of the show's universe, the amnesia has a different character, and the episode about Principal Skinner's identity is the place where the show accidentally made the character of the amnesia explicit. Armin Tamzarian has been living as Seymour Skinner for 2 decades. He took the real Skinner's identity after Skinner was presumed dead in Vietnam, arrived in Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death, and found that Agnes Skinner needed him to be her son. The deception was not planned. It grew from a moment of compassion, from a man with no identity of his own, encountering a woman who needed something that he could, if he chose, provide. He chose, and 20 years of living the life that followed from that choice had accumulated on top of it. When the real Skinner arrives and the truth is exposed, the town faces a choice. They have the information. They have the real Skinner standing in front of them, visibly real, unambiguously the person whose identity was borrowed. They have the capacity to acknowledge the truth, to restore the real Skinner to his own name, to thank Tamzarian for his service and allow the situation to resolve in the direction that the facts indicate it should resolve. They choose differently. The town holds a meeting, the truth is present in the room, and they vote to not accept the truth. They vote to continue the fiction. The judge issues a legal decree stating that Tamzarian is Skinner, legally and formally, regardless of the evidence. The real Skinner is removed, physically removed, tied to a train, expelled from the town that should have been his to return to. And it is made explicitly, formally, legally illegal to ever acknowledge what the episode revealed. Under penalty of torture, the show plays this as absurdist comedy. But what it is actually depicting is the mechanism of Springfield's amnesia, not the failure to remember, the active choice to not remember. The collective decision that the truth of what happened is less valuable than the stability of the fiction that preceded the truth's emergence. And the formalization of that decision into an explicit social contract: we have chosen the lie, we are maintaining the lie, anyone who tells the truth will be expelled. This is how Springfield handles every crisis. Not through the comedy of forgetting, not through the cartoon convenience of the reset button, but through active, collective, deliberate choice. The dome comes down and the town does not talk about it because the town has decided not to talk about it. The sun comes back and nobody asks how that happened, because asking how that happened would lead to questions about why it was blocked in the first place, which would lead to questions about Burns, which would lead to questions about everything downstream of Burns, and that chain of questions is one that Springfield has decided it does not want to follow to its conclusion. The real Seymour Skinner is the show's most vivid image of what happens to people who carry true information in Springfield. He arrives with proof. He presents it. He is correct. He is expelled. Every person in Springfield's history who has come with accurate information that contradicted the comfortable narrative has had a version of this experience. The truth is presented. The truth is real. The truth is removed from the community, in whatever form that removal takes, through legal decree, through collective inattention, through the specific social mechanisms that communities develop for managing information they would rather not have. And the comfortable fiction continues, because the alternative, actually following the truth to where it leads, would mean following it all the way to the power plant, all the way to the cracked cooling towers, all the way to the contracts and the arrangements, and the 100-year-old man who made all of it and has been running it ever since. Springfield knows, at some level, what is there. It knows in the same way that a patient who has been told a diagnosis they cannot emotionally process knows their diagnosis, not in the sense of being able to act on the information, but in the sense of having been told and having chosen to not let the telling change anything. The information went in, the choice to manage it out was made, and the management has been continuous and disciplined and collectively maintained for as long as anyone in the town can remember. Which is not very long because that is how the management works. Supplemental: Maggie Simpson and the Long Silence. There is someone in the Simpson household who has heard everything we have been talking about tonight, who has been present for all of it, in every room, for 36 years, who has watched Homer's management by Burns, watched Marge's management of the household, watched Lisa's frustrated clarity, watched Bart's improvisational navigation of a world that never gave him the right formation for it, who has seen all of it and said, for 36 years, almost nothing. Maggie Simpson has been 1 year old for 36 years. She cannot walk reliably. She communicates primarily through her pacifier and through the occasional expression that carries more information than most full sentences. She is the family member that other people in Springfield most systematically underestimate. And she is, if you track her actual actions across the show's history, the most capable and the most strategically sophisticated person in the Simpson household. She shot Mr. Burns. This is officially established. The investigation concluded it. Burns confirmed it. The legal consequence was 0 because, as Chief Wiggum observed, no jury in the world would convict a baby. And Maggie, who cannot walk without falling, who cannot form sentences, who communicates in a register that adults systematically misread as simpler than it is, Maggie committed an act of violence against the most powerful man in Springfield and faced no consequence for it. This is the most successful outcome anyone in Springfield has ever achieved against Burns. Burns was incapacitated, hospitalized. The plant was briefly without its owner and operator, and the person responsible was completely immune to accountability. Maggie is the only person in the show's history to achieve this, and she did it from the position of maximum social invisibility. The final shot of the Burns shooting episode is the one that demands the most careful attention. Everyone has left the hospital room. Maggie is alone. She looks around carefully, deliberately scanning the space to confirm that no one is watching. And then, when she has confirmed her solitude, she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. Not reflexively, not accidentally. With the deliberateness of someone who is in private, who has chosen to be in private for this moment, and who is doing something that they understand should not be done publicly, that sequence of behaviors check surroundings, confirm privacy, then act is not infant behavior. Infants do not conduct security sweeps before performing private actions. They do not have the theory of mind that would allow them to understand that an action has different implications depending on who is watching. The checking and the confirmation and the private reenactment are the behaviors of someone who understands what they did, understands why it matters, and understands that the understanding should not be visible. The show is telling you, in that final shot, that Maggie knows exactly what she is doing. It is also telling you, because of the 36 years of silence that surrounds that shot, that knowing what you are doing and choosing not to let people know that you know is a viable strategy, that it has been Maggie's strategy all along. Lisa's intelligence is visible. She announces it. She deploys it in the social space where it generates friction and isolation and the specific loneliness of being the smartest person in a room that resents smart people. She uses her intelligence publicly because her ethics require her to, because she cannot see something that matters and remain silent about it, because the intelligence is inseparable from the commitment that the intelligence generates. Maggie has watched Lisa, has watched what Lisa's approach to intelligence produces, has watched the friction and the isolation and the frustration that come from being visibly capable in a community that has no use for that visibility. And Maggie has made a different choice. Not the choice of suppression. She has not buried the intelligence, has not trained herself to perform lower capability than she has. The intelligence is fully operational. She has simply made the choice about what to do with it, to keep it private, to deploy it in the spaces where no one is watching, in the margins of the family's attention, in the places where the things she does will be attributed to accident or baby behavior rather than to intentional action. The Longest Daycare, the theatrical short that was nominated for an Academy Award, is the most extended look inside Maggie's operational reality. Alone in a daycare center, without the familiar context of her family, she navigates a situation that requires observation, planning, improvisation, the prediction of other actors' behavior, and the execution of a multi-step plan that succeeds because no one monitoring her situation is capable of crediting her with the strategic intelligence that is running behind the apparent passivity of being a 1-year-old. She is calm throughout. She makes no dramatic gestures, produces no signals that would attract attention to what she is doing. She operates in the background. The plan is executed in the margins. And it works because no one in the facility has any reason to believe that the baby in the corner is the one to watch. This is the complete portrait, a mind of extraordinary capability, housed in a body that provides perfect camouflage, deployed in an environment where the camouflage is so effective that the capability is essentially undetectable. Maggie is the most powerful person in the Simpson household, not despite being the most overlooked, but because of it. The overlooking is the source of the power, not the obstacle to it. She watches Springfield. She has been watching Springfield for 36 years. She has seen everything we have discussed tonight, every arrangement, every accommodation, every pattern of failure that is actually a pattern of design. She has the full picture that Homer cannot assemble because his cognitive limitations prevent it, that Marge manages but does not fully confront, that Lisa sees and cannot act on, that Bart does not have the patience to sit still long enough to compile. Maggie has the picture, and she has said nothing. Not because she cannot. The show has established that she has the linguistic capacity to speak when she chooses, but because she has assessed the situation and determined that speaking is not yet the optimal action. What is she waiting for? The show has not told us. 36 years of watching and waiting, and whatever the threshold is, it has not yet been reached. When it is reached, when Maggie decides that the moment has arrived and the action is worth the sacrifice of the invisibility, that will be something that Springfield has not seen coming. That nobody has seen coming, because nobody has been paying attention, which is, of course, exactly how Maggie designed it. Supplemental. The Simpsons' relationship with America. We have spent tonight examining Springfield from inside, looking at the specific people and the specific arrangements and the specific patterns that make Springfield what it is. But it is worth pulling back at the end and considering what Springfield is from outside. What it means that this specific town, with these specific dynamics, has been the image through which America has been examining itself for 36 years. The Simpsons did not invent the satire of American domestic life. It did not invent the comedy of working-class family dysfunction, of the gap between what America says it is and what it demonstrably is, of the specific texture of middle-class compromise, with a system that promises more than it delivers. These themes existed in American comedy and culture before the show began. What The Simpsons did was hold them steady. For 36 years, every Sunday night, the same image. A family in a house in a town, imperfect and enduring, surrounded by the specific institutions of American life, the nuclear power plant, the church, the school, the police station, the convenience store, the bar, the hospital, the government, all of them operating in the specific way that American institutions actually operate, which is not the way they say they operate. This consistency across 36 years produces something that shorter-lived satires cannot produce. It produces a record, a documented, episodic, repeatedly examined record of what these institutions looked like across these decades. And the record, when you read it as a record rather than as a series of individual comedy episodes, shows you things that are harder to see episode by episode. Burns has been getting older for 36 years, which means Burns has been getting more established. The power he had in Season 1 is the same power he has in Season 36, but the power has had 36 more years to embed itself, to become the structural feature of Springfield's world that it always was, but that newer viewers take as given rather than seeing as the result of deliberate accumulation. Homer has been in Sector 7G for 36 years, which means Homer's arrangement with Burns has had 36 more years to become invisible as an arrangement and visible simply as the shape of Homer's life. The thing that was designed looks, after enough time, like the thing that simply is. That is what sustained exposure does to the visibility of design. Springfield's collective amnesia has been running for 36 years, which means every episode that the town has forgotten, every crisis that has been absorbed and reset, has had 36 years to become the model for how crisis is handled. Not the unusual response, the default. The thing you do when something happens that you do not want to have happened. You wait for the episode to end and you start fresh, and you do not talk about it. This is the thing The Simpsons has been teaching, quietly and by example, for 36 years. Not as prescription, not as endorsement, as description. This is what it looks like. This is what the mechanism is. This is how the arrangement perpetuates itself. Watch. America has been watching. And the image in the mirror has become familiar enough that it sometimes stops reading as a mirror and starts reading as a window. As if Springfield is a place you could look at from the outside, rather than a reflection of the place you are already inside. But you are inside it. We all are. The specific version of it that Springfield depicts, the nuclear plant, and the corrupt mayor, and the selective police incompetence, and the billionaire who has been running it longer than anyone can remember, and the families getting by in the middle of it all with love and frustration and donuts, and saxophone music. This is a version of something that is not fictional. The institutions are real. The arrangements are real. The specific ecology of power and dependency and accommodation and collective amnesia is real. Springfield drew it clearly enough that you could see it. That was the gift the show was giving you. 36 years of clearly drawn. 36 years of every Sunday night. 36 years of here is what it looks like. Here is how it works. Here are the people inside it managing as best they can. And every week, the family comes home. The family always comes home. That part, at least, is also true. Supplemental. The floating timeline and what frozen time actually means. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when the show began in December 1989. He is 10 years old as you read this. 36 years have passed in the world outside Springfield, and not a single one of them has passed inside it. Bart is still in the 4th grade. Lisa is still in the 2nd. Maggie is still 1 year old and still nursing the same pacifier. Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s. The house on Evergreen Terrace still has the same furniture, still has the same dimensions, still has the same quality of light coming through the same windows. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. The present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025 using the technology of 2025, referencing the culture of 2025, inhabiting a world that is contemporaneous with the broadcast. But the characters are always the same ages. Their personal histories do not accumulate in the way that real personal histories accumulate. Homer does not approach middle age. He is perpetually in it. Bart does not approach adolescence. He is perpetually almost there. This is accepted as a feature of animated television by people who have watched enough animated television to know the convention. You do not ask why Bart is still 10. You accept the premise and move on. The floating timeline is the water the show swims in, and asking about it feels like asking why cartoons can survive things that would kill real people. It is just how this works. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions of a specific and interesting kind. The backstory of Homer and Marge's relationship, how they met, what era their courtship was set in, what the cultural context of their early years together was, this backstory has been told multiple times across the show's run, and each telling places it in a different decade. They were high school sweethearts in the late 70s and early 80s. Then, in later episodes, they were high school sweethearts in the late 80s. Then the 90s. Then the early 2000s. The story is the same, the shyness and the attraction, and the eventual togetherness, but the era reshapes itself around them as the floating timeline drags the present forward. This means Homer and Marge do not have a fixed past. Their past is unstable, rewritten when the current episode requires a flashback that is consistent with the characters being in their mid-30s in the present day rather than in their 60s. The show takes their origin story, the single most important story in the family's history, the story about how they became the people the whole show is built around, and it revises it, quietly and without fanfare, whenever the timeline demands it. The memories are not real. The past is a draft that keeps getting updated. And the characters do not notice because the characters cannot notice, because noticing would require the kind of temporal perspective that the floating timeline prevents them from having. The coma theory accounts for this in the most emotionally satisfying way. If Homer has been dreaming since 1993, then the instability of his memories of the past is exactly what you would expect. A dreaming mind does not have access to the actual past. It has impressions, fragments, emotional memories that carry feeling without always carrying fact. When Homer's dreaming brain needs to construct a flashback to his high school relationship with Marge, it does not retrieve an accurate memory. It generates an impression shaped by whatever the present dream context requires. The era shifts because the dreaming mind is not retrieving a fixed record. It is constructing something new out of available materials each time. And the emotions are always consistent even when the facts are not. Homer always feels the same way about Marge in these flashbacks. The shyness, the desperate wanting, the specific joy of someone who was afraid he would not be wanted. Discovering that he was wanted, this is constant across every retelling in every era. The facts change because the dreaming mind does not care about facts. The feelings are locked in because the dreaming mind cares about nothing else. This is the core of the coma theory's emotional power. It does not propose that the show is bad or wrong or incoherent. It proposes that the show's inconsistencies are the inconsistencies of grief, of a man who is losing himself and knows it and is holding on to what matters most by generating it over and over again, slightly different each time, always trying to get closer to the thing he cannot quite reach, because the thing is real and the dream is not. Homer loves Marge. The dreaming mind keeps finding ways to say so. Every flashback, every variation, every differently era's retelling of how they met it is the same love story being told again because the love is the thing the dreaming mind is trying to preserve. Not the facts of the story. The love that the story is about. The floating timeline is not a production convenience. It is the shape of Homer's dream, frozen at the moment he went under, moving forward through the present without ever arriving at the future where his children have grown and the house has changed, and Marge has different lines around her eyes, and the family has become something he did not see coming because he was not conscious for it. In the dream, they are always this age. In the dream, there is always time. In the dream, the evening never ends and the weekend never runs out and nobody ever has to say the word that means this particular version of the family is over. The floating timeline is not laziness. The floating timeline is love. Supplemental. The power plant as the center of everything. We have returned to the nuclear power plant multiple times tonight, from multiple angles, and this is not accidental. The plant is the gravitational center of Springfield's world in a way that goes beyond its role as Burns's business, or Homer's workplace, or the source of the town's electricity. The plant is the explanatory center. The thing that, once you see it clearly, makes everything else legible. The plant was built in Springfield for the same reason that all nuclear power plants in the 20th century were built where they were built, because the communities where they were sited had the specific combination of geographic features the plants required, the specific characteristics that made the siting practical, and crucially, the specific political and economic vulnerabilities that made them unable to resist. Communities that could have resisted did not get nuclear plants. Communities that could not resist got nuclear plants, and the plants got the communities, and the relationship between the two has been the fundamental dynamic of those communities ever since. Springfield could not resist. Burns was already there when the plant was proposed, because Burns is always already there. The economic ecosystem that makes the plant's siting politically viable is the economic ecosystem Burns spent decades constructing to ensure that his next enterprise would find the community prepared to accept it. The plant did not arrive and change Springfield. Springfield was prepared for the plant, and the plant completed an arrangement that was already substantially in place. The radiation is the mechanism of control that no other mechanism Burns might have deployed could have achieved with the same efficiency. Economic dependency keeps people in place and keeps them compliant. But economic dependency can be broken through sufficiently motivated collective action or through the appearance of credible alternatives. The history of labor movements and community organizing is the history of people in exactly Springfield's economic situation deciding that the dependency was worth fighting against, that the risk of collective action was less than the cost of continued submission. The radiation, if the theory is correct, removes this option. It does not threaten. It does not intimidate. It operates at the cellular level, below the level of political consciousness, below the level of the decisions that political consciousness makes. It diminishes the cognitive function that political consciousness requires. It makes the specific kind of sustained, coordinated, strategically sophisticated response that effective resistance requires slightly more difficult for every person in the exposed population. Not impossible, slightly more difficult, and slightly more difficult, compounded across an entire community across decades of exposure, produces a population that is not incapable of resistance, but that consistently finds resistance impractical, exhausting, just a bit too much to organize and maintain against the background noise of everything else that daily life requires. This is the most insidious version of control that exists. The version that does not feel like control because it operates through the degradation of the capacity to recognize control. The population of Springfield does not feel controlled. They feel like themselves. They feel like people making their own choices, living their own lives, experiencing their own particular mix of satisfaction and frustration with the specific world they inhabit. The choices they are making are real choices, made freely, without coercion. The choices are just being made by people whose decision-making capacity has been gently, consistently, imperceptibly diminished by the thing that powers their electricity. The three-eyed fish is the show's image for this. It appears in the river near the plant, the product of whatever the plant's runoff has done to the genetic stability of the wildlife in the watershed. It is impossible to look at. A fish with three eyes is visually striking, obviously wrong, obviously the result of something that should not be happening. Burns is forced to eat the fish on television to demonstrate that the fish is harmless, and the town watches, and the town accepts, and the investigation ends. The town accepts the three-eyed fish as the new normal. It adjusts its definition of normal to accommodate the three-eyed fish. The three-eyed fish becomes, within a few episodes, a background feature of Springfield's world rather than an ongoing scandal. It is referenced occasionally for comedy and treated as the kind of local quirk that gives a town its character. This is the same thing that happens with every anomaly that the plant produces. The anomaly is noticed. The anomaly is addressed in some performative way. The anomaly is accepted. The new normal absorbs the anomaly and continues. By the time the new normal has incorporated enough anomalies, it looks nothing like any definition of normal that would have been recognizable at the beginning. The yellowed skin and the four fingers and the bulging eyes that characterize every Springfield resident, the injuries that heal faster than they should, the cognitive capacities that are not what they should be, the biological characteristics that no isolated population shares with every other population. All of this has been absorbed into the new normal of Springfield's reality. And nobody asks. Because asking requires a standard of comparison, requires the ability to hold the current state against some other state and notice the difference. And the current state has been the current state for long enough that the comparison state has become historical, abstract, not available as a lived reference point against which the current state would read as anomalous. The plant erased its own anomalousness by being present long enough that the anomalousness became the baseline. This is the long game of environmental contamination. Not the dramatic disaster, not the visible catastrophe that generates outrage and response. The slow accumulation, the gradual shift, the new normal arriving in increments so small that no individual increment is legible as change, and the cumulative change that results is so total that it reads not as change but as simply the way things are. Springfield is the way things are. Burns made sure of it. And the plant keeps running, and the electricity keeps flowing, and the yellow faces go about their days, and nobody in Springfield will ever look up at the cracked cooling towers and ask the question that the question would lead to. Because the plant made sure they couldn't. Supplemental. Krusty's Deeper Tragedy, the show that outlasted the reason for it. We talked about Krusty earlier. But there is a layer of Krusty's situation that deserves more careful attention, which is the layer that involves time. Krusty has been doing the show for decades. He was doing the show before the show's events began. He was doing the show when Bart was a small child who watched it and was shaped by it in the specific way that children are shaped by the first entertainers they believe in. And he is still doing the show now. In the same market, in the same format, with the same basic structure and the same basic character. The world around the show has changed. Children's television has changed. The specific conventions of the live-action variety format that Krusty's show represents, the slapstick, the clown makeup, the studio audience of children, the combination of entertainment and product endorsement that defines the Krusty brand. These conventions are not what they were when the show began. The landscape that made that format viable has shifted. The audiences that made it a significant cultural force have aged into adults who now have their own children, and those children's relationship to entertainment is different. But Krusty's show continues, not because the format is still optimal, but because the show is what Krusty has. The show is the thing he built his adult identity around. Walking away from it would mean not just losing the revenue and the platform, but losing the only context in which Krusty the Clown has ever existed as a coherent self. Outside the makeup, outside the studio, outside the specific context of being Krusty, who is he? He is Herschel, and Herschel is a person he has not been in decades, a person who may not be retrievable in any form that is livable for the man Krusty has become. The show is his prison and his home simultaneously. This is the specific quality of long-term commitments that become identities. You cannot tell, after enough time inside them, whether you are maintaining the commitment because it is right for you or because you have become the commitment, and the commitment is the only you that you have easy access to. Krusty does not know whether he would want to do the show if he could choose freely, because he has not been able to choose freely in so long that the concept of free choice feels abstract. The show is what he does. It is what he is. Asking whether he wants to do it is like asking whether he wants to be himself. Bart's love for Krusty is the thing that makes this bearable for both of them. Bart's relationship with the show is the relationship of someone for whom the show was genuinely formative, not as a media product, not as entertainment in the abstract, but as the specific thing that first taught him what it felt like to laugh at something, to be surprised by something, to experience the specific joy of a comedic moment landing. Krusty was the first comedian Bart believed in. The child who believed is now 10 years old still, forever, which means the relationship is preserved in amber in the same way everything in Springfield is preserved in amber. Bart's faith in Krusty is the faith of a child, and it does not age because Bart does not age. And Krusty, whose ordinary audience has grown up and left the format behind, still has in Bart the perfect viewer, the one for whom the format is still exactly right, who does not experience it as dated, who experiences it as it was experienced at its best. This is what Krusty is performing the show for. Not for the changing landscape of children's television. For Bart. For the one viewer who has not aged out of it. For the faith that Bart has extended and that Krusty has accepted and that both of them maintain in the only way available, which is by continuing to show up and doing the show and not asking too carefully about whether the original reasons for doing it are still operative. The show goes on, the makeup goes on, the audience laughs, because Springfield's children still watch, because they have always watched, because Krusty is what they have and what their parents had and what their grandparents had, and the continuity itself is a kind of comfort that the specific content becomes secondary to. Krusty has outlasted the reasons for his show, but the show keeps going, and every afternoon the lights come up, and he does the voice, and somewhere in the studio audience there is a child who is having the exact experience that Bart had at his age, who is believing in Krusty for the first time, for whom none of this is tired or complicated or aged past its moment. That child exists every afternoon. Krusty performs for that child every afternoon. And the grief and the debt and the mob connections and the estrangement from his father and everything else that has accumulated around the show is still there, but it is off stage, behind the flats, out of the light. In the light there is just the clown and the child and the laugh. That is not nothing. After all this time, that is not nothing at all. Supplemental. The conspiracy of the Treehouse non-canon as pressure valve. We talked earlier about the bleeding from the Treehouse of Horror episodes into the regular continuity, but there is another dimension of the Treehouse phenomenon worth examining, which is the function it serves for the writers. The Treehouse format is a pressure valve. It is the space where the show can do what the regular format cannot allow it to do. And what the regular format cannot allow is resolution. The reset mechanism that defines the regular show, that prevents consequences from carrying forward, that ensures Homer will be in Sector 7G, and Bart will be in 4th grade, and Springfield will be intact at the beginning of every new episode. This mechanism is a formal requirement of the show's commercial viability. You cannot sustain 700 episodes of a show in which consequences accumulate, because eventually the weight of accumulated consequences makes the show too heavy to carry, and the comedy too dark to function as comedy. The Treehouse episodes are the place where the weight can be discharged, where Homer can die, where Bart can be killed, where Springfield can be genuinely destroyed, where the things the regular show implies but cannot commit to can be committed to, inside the container of the anthology format, with the non-canonical disclaimer available for anyone who needs the protection of knowing it was not real. But writers are not neutral parties to this process. The writers know the characters. They have, in many cases, spent years with these characters, understanding their depths, understanding what the characters contain that the regular format cannot accommodate. When they write the Treehouse episodes, they are not simply generating horror premises with familiar characters inserted. They are using the Treehouse format to access parts of the characters that the regular format walls off. The shining parody accesses something real about Homer's relationship to his family, to his own interior life, to the specific condition of being someone whose genuine feelings are consistently mediated by the requirements of the performance of normalcy. The third dimension segment accesses something real about Homer's relationship to the reality he inhabits, to the membrane of the cartoon world, to what it might feel like to be aware that you exist inside a fiction. The horror episode that depicts Bart's future as dark and unresolved accesses something real about the trajectory that Bart's qualities and Springfield's formation of him seem to point toward. The writers are telling you something real in the Treehouse episodes. The format lets them tell it, and the non-canonical disclaimer lets them tell it without the audience demanding that the regular show follow through on the implications. This is the genius of the format, and also its limitation. The truth gets told, and then it gets put in a box labeled fiction, and the regular show resumes and the box stays closed. But the truth was told. It was shown to you. The non-canonical label does not make it not true. It makes it not actionable within the show's narrative. But the truth is still in you, the viewer, where it was placed by the episode you just watched. The Treehouse episodes are what the show knows but cannot officially know. Every year, in October, the show tells you what it knows. And then November comes, and the regular show resumes, and nobody mentions it. But you heard it. You watched it. It is in you somewhere, under the layer of fiction, under the label of non-canonical horror anthology. The knowledge that the show offered and then officially withdrew. That knowledge is the truest thing The Simpsons has ever said about itself and its characters. It just had to say it in October, with the lights off, in the space where the real things live. Supplemental. Sideshow Bob's Alternative Life. There is a version of Sideshow Bob's life that the show gestures at but never allows to fully develop, and the gesture is worth examining because it reveals something about what Bob is actually looking for underneath the vendetta. The operetta episode, the episode that ends with Bob singing the entirety of the Major General's song from Gilbert and Sullivan's Pirates of Penzance to delay his own execution, is the show's clearest statement of what Bob could be in a different arrangement. He is not performing the song as a delay tactic in the primary sense. He is performing it because he is Bob, because Gilbert and Sullivan are his home territory, because in the specific emergency of facing death, his instinct is to go to the thing that is most entirely his own. And the song is good. The performance is genuinely impressive. The vocal capability is real, and the musical intelligence behind the performance is real, and the specific quality of someone who genuinely loves this music performing it in extremis is real. This is Bob, more completely Bob, than any of the murder plots. The murder plots are Bob doing what the situation with Bart has made him into. The song is Bob being what he would have been if the situation with Bart had never happened. He received a standing ovation, even from the people who were waiting to execute him. This is the show being honest about something it usually keeps implicit, that if Bob were in a different context, if his capabilities were deployed toward a different end, if the vendetta had not become the organizing principle of his adult life, he would be extraordinary. He would be the kind of performer who receives standing ovations not as an interruption to an execution, but as the culmination of a performance people chose to attend. There are episodes that imagine exactly this version of Bob. Episodes in which he is out of prison, in which he is in a context that does not immediately require the Bart plot, in which he is allowed to be a person with dimensions other than obsessive antagonist. And in these episodes, Bob is often remarkably agreeable company. His cultural knowledge is genuine and wide. His taste is defensible and sometimes genuinely illuminating. He is capable of conversation, real conversation, the kind that leaves you knowing something you did not know before. He is, under the right conditions, a person you would want to spend time with. The show knows this. It shows you this Bob in those episodes and then puts him back in the position where the Bart plot reasserts itself, where he has to be the sideshow Bob that the show requires him to be, and the Bob who was genuinely interesting to talk to recedes behind the Bob who is trapped in the vendetta. This is what the coma theory does to sideshow Bob, if you apply it. In Homer's dream, Bob must keep being the antagonist because the dream requires Bart to have an antagonist, and Bob is the antagonist. The Bob who could be something else. The Bob who gave the standing ovation performance that Bob exists in the dream only in glimpses, only in moments when the dream's narrative requirements briefly loosen. When the nightmare logic of the vendetta temporarily releases, and when it releases, you see him, not the character, the person the character was built around, the one who would rather be performing Gilbert and Sullivan than anything else in the world, and who has been stuck, for reasons that were never really about him, doing something else entirely. Supplemental: the marriage of Homer and Marge, what 36 years looks like from inside. There are people who watch The Simpsons primarily for Homer. There are people who watch it for Bart. There are people who watch it for the satire of American institutions, for the specific texture of Springfield's civic dysfunction, for the guest stars or the celebrity parodies or the musical numbers or the Treehouse episodes. But there is a case to be made that the deepest thing the show has ever done, the sustained achievement across 36 years that is easiest to overlook because it is present in every episode rather than being a feature of specific episodes, is the portrait of a long marriage. Homer and Marge have been together for the entirety of the show. They have been together in the backstory that predates the show. They will presumably be together for however much longer the show runs. Their marriage is the structural given of the show's universe, in a way that nothing else quite is. The thing that does not change, even when everything around it changes, the element that the show has always treated as foundational rather than as premise. This is unusual in the history of television comedy. Television comedy tends to generate its energy from the uncertainty of romantic relationships, the will they won they dynamic, the obstacles to coupling that produce plot, the specific pleasures of watching people find each other or fail to find each other. When shows reach the point of the couple being together, the conventional television wisdom has historically been that the energy deflates, that the interest was in the tension, not the resolution. The Simpsons did not do this. The Simpsons started with the resolution: Homer and Marge are already married, already parents, already established in the life they will inhabit for the show's run, and built its energy elsewhere. Not from whether they will be together, from what it is like to be together. From the specific daily texture of two people who chose each other and are choosing each other again, across decades, across the accumulation of their particular versions of the ordinary disasters that marriage contains. What the show has discovered, across 36 years of inhabiting this marriage, is something that is genuinely difficult to find in any other medium: the accurate texture of the long relationship. Not the idealized version, not the comforting fiction that long marriages are characterized by sustained romantic intensity, or by conflict-free companionship, or by the resolution of the fundamental differences that always existed between the two people. The accurate version, in which the love is real and continuous and the differences are also real and continuous, and neither the love nor the differences ever fully resolve each other. Homer is difficult to be married to. This is not a complicated observation. He is forgetful, self-absorbed, inconsistent, prone to impulse and resistant to reflection. He consumes more than he produces in most of the domains that a functional partnership requires. He leaves the maintenance of the relationship, the emotional labor, the management of the family's internal dynamics, disproportionately to Marge. He generates crises at a rate that would exhaust most people and exits those crises through Homer-specific channels: the cartoon resilience, the sincere apology that forgets it has been issued before, the love that is genuine even when the behavior that surrounds it is not. And Marge stays. Not because she cannot leave. The show has depicted across multiple episodes that Marge has the capacity to imagine a different life. That she has had specific moments of crisis in the marriage where leaving was a real option rather than an abstract one. That she has encountered people who offered things that Homer cannot offer: stability, sophistication, the sense of being seen by someone whose perception is not limited by the specific limitations of Homer's perception. She stays because the love is real, because the specific, imperfect, continuously renegotiated attachment she has to this specific man is not something she can replicate with someone who has better qualities in the domains where Homer is deficient. The qualities that make Homer impossible to be married to are connected to the qualities that make Homer, the spontaneity, the sincerity, the complete absence of strategic self-presentation, the way he loves her without calculation and without performance in a world where most love involves some degree of both. The impossible parts and the irreplaceable parts are not separable. She cannot extract the irreplaceable parts from the impossible ones because they are the same thing expressed differently in different contexts. This is the show's most sophisticated observation about long relationships: that the thing you cannot stand about the person you love is often the same thing, differently expressed, as the thing you love most about them. Homer's sincerity that makes him irreplaceable is the same quality that makes him incapable of the sustained self-management that the marriage's maintenance would benefit from. His wholeness, his refusal to be partially present, his inability to inhabit any role that is not completely his. These are the things that make him Homer, and make him lovable, and make him exhausting, and make him impossible, and make him the specific person Marge chose. And Marge's patience, which contains Homer's disasters and maintains the family's stability and provides the emotional infrastructure that the household requires. This patience is not passivity. It is the specific active work of someone who has decided that the relationship is worth the maintenance it requires and who performs that maintenance every day with the consistency of someone who has been doing it long enough to have stopped needing to decide about it consciously. It is as automatic as breathing and as sustained as any labor the show depicts anyone performing. What the floating timeline does to this marriage is both preservation and something adjacent to tragedy. It keeps them at the moment where the marriage is still actively demanding, still requiring daily recommitment, still containing the specific texture of two people who are not quite resolved into each other, but who are always in the process of doing so. The accumulation that should happen over 36 years, the deepening, the mellowing, the specific transformation of active love into something more like companionship that might be warmer or might be emptier, depending on the specific couple, does not happen. They are always in the middle, never at the beginning, never anywhere near the end, perpetually in the sustained effort of maintaining what they have against the entropy that effort exists to resist. This is the most accurate portrait of what long marriages actually are, and The Simpsons arrived at it by accident through the mechanics of the floating timeline. The fact that nobody ages, which was a production decision and not a philosophical one, produced a philosophical result. A marriage that exists only in its own duration, never before and never after, always in the middle of being what it is, always choosing again, every episode. Supplemental. Hans Moleman and the Question of Death. Hans Moleman has died in The Simpsons more times than any other character in the history of American animation. He has been hit by cars. He has been crushed by objects dropped from significant heights. He has been buried alive, electrocuted, burned, attacked by animals, incinerated. He has died violently, comically, absurdly, and in ways that the show clearly regards as some of its most reliable comic resources. You can always get a laugh from Hans Moleman dying. He is always back the next time he appears. No explanation, no resurrection scene, no acknowledgement that the man who was very definitively killed 2 episodes ago is present in this episode having a conversation at the Springfield town hall. He is simply back, small and nearly blind and optimistic in his limited way, waiting to die again. Most viewers accept this as a running gag and do not pursue it further, because it is a running gag and pursuing it further does not seem like the kind of thing the show has invited. The gag is the gag. The humor is the humor. Hans Moleman dies and comes back and dies again because that is the bit, and the bit is funny, and the comedy is the point. But Hans Moleman once stated his age as 31 years old. He said this directly, on camera, in a regular canonical episode. He is visibly not 31. He appears to be somewhere between 70 and 90, based on his apparent physical condition. He has the visible characteristics of very advanced age, the slow movement, the thickened vision, the compressed physicality that decades of existence produce. If he is 31, something has happened to him, something that compressed what should have been a normal human aging process into a fraction of the time that process should take. Something that aged a man catastrophically, faster than biology normally operates, and that has also given him the specific quality of not dying when he is killed. The radiation theory has an answer for both of these things. A body exposed to sufficient radiation does not age normally. It ages in the specific way that radiation damage produces, which is different from ordinary cellular aging and potentially much faster. The same exposure that produces accelerated aging might also produce the specific kind of cellular resilience that makes the body capable of recovering from trauma that should be fatal. Burns's body has done something like this, sustained by the radiation treatments that maintain the disease equilibrium that keeps him alive. The radiation that is killing Springfield's residents slowly, degrading them across decades of low-level exposure, might in Hans Moleman's specific case be interacting with his particular biology in a way that produces both the accelerated aging and the impossible recovery. He is Springfield's most extreme case. He is what happens when the radiation exposure produces its most pronounced effects on a single individual. The aging and the resilience both turned up past any setting the theory would predict as plausible. He is the evidence made walking, the proof of what the plant's runoff is doing to the community's biology, personified in the form of a small man who looks 90, claims to be 31, and dies every few weeks without ever staying dead. Under the collective denial theory, the theory that Springfield actively maintains the fiction of its own normalcy through deliberate collective choice, Hans Mollmann's repeated deaths are the most extraordinary example of what that denial is capable of. A man dies, visibly, in public, in front of witnesses, and nobody investigates. Nobody convenes a council. Nobody asks the most obvious question, which is how this specific man keeps appearing alive in subsequent weeks after having been unambiguously killed in previous ones. The town does not acknowledge the pattern because acknowledging the pattern would require acknowledging what the pattern implies, and what the pattern implies is something that Springfield has decided it does not want to know. Hans Mollmann moves through Springfield's world as a figure that the town has collectively agreed to not look at too carefully. He is there, visibly, in the background of scenes, present at public events, occasionally involved in interactions with named characters. But the way he is there is the way that inconvenient things are there in communities that have developed the specific skill of selective non-noticing. Present but not attended to, visible but not seen. A data point that is observed and not processed because processing it would initiate a chain of processing that the community's maintenance systems are configured to prevent. Hans Mollmann is Springfield's conscience and Springfield's embarrassment simultaneously. The thing the town cannot hide and will not address. The 31-year-old who looks 90, dying in public every few weeks, coming back without explanation, waiting patiently to die again. Under the coma theory, he is a dream character, without enough of Homer's attention to maintain consistently a background process that lags and crashes and restarts, without the coherent narrative logic that the dream's primary figures have. Homer's unconscious mind does not care enough about Hans Mollmann to maintain the continuity of his existence. He dies because the dreaming mind lets him lapse, and he comes back because the dream needs him to populate the next scene, and the death and the revival leave no trace because the dreaming mind that generated them has already moved on to something it cares about more. Hans Mollmann is what happens to the figures at the edge of the dream. The ones that the dreaming mind generates and discards and generates again, never quite consistently, never with the sustained attention that would make them more than flickering presences at the margins of the story. He will be back next week. He will die again soon after. And Springfield will not notice, because Springfield has decided not to notice, and that decision is the whole explanation and the whole horror simultaneously. Supplemental. Mona Simpson and What Was Lost. We discussed Mona Simpson's story briefly in connection with the Sector 7G conspiracy, but Mona's story is worth inhabiting at greater length, because it is the story that illuminates everything else about the Simpson family's trajectory and about what Burns has cost them across 3 generations. Mona was, before 1969, ordinary. This is the show's word for her, and it is used without condescension ordinary in the way that most people are ordinary, which is to say fully formed and specific and real, but not yet having encountered the circumstances that would reveal to herself and to others what she was capable of in extremis. She was a housewife in Springfield. She was married to Abe Simpson, who was the person he was before the arrangements and the compromises of the following decades shaped him into the person the show depicts. She had a young son named Homer. She was radicalized, gradually, in the way that people are gradually radicalized by the sustained encounter with injustice that they find impossible to look away from. The Civil Rights Movement. Vietnam. The specific moral clarity of an era in which the gap between what the country said it was and what it demonstrably was had become impossible for a certain kind of person to ignore. Mona was that kind of person. The moral clarity was not imposed on her from outside. It was generated from inside, from the specific quality of her attention to the world around her, from the inability to not see what she saw. She joined a group. The group's target was Burns's biological weapons laboratory. The laboratory was producing, in Springfield, in the same town where her family lived, agents designed to cause mass casualty events. This is not a gray area morally. A biological weapons laboratory operating in a residential area is not a matter of competing perspectives. It is an unambiguous wrong, and Mona understood it as such, and she acted on the understanding. The action succeeded. The laboratory was destroyed. The agents were destroyed. Nobody was physically harmed by the raid except through the accidental cure of Clancy Wiggum's asthma, which the show treats as a comedy beat but which, taken seriously for a moment, is a reminder that the people conducting the raid were not nihilists or terrorists in any meaningful sense of the word. They were people who wanted to destroy something dangerous, and the most dramatic collateral effect of their action was accidentally treating someone's respiratory condition. Mona made the mistake of compassion. She stopped to help someone who had fallen in the chaos. The person was Burns. He saw her face. He called the FBI. From that moment, Mona Simpson's life was over in the form it had taken. She could not go home. She could not be Abe's wife. She could not be Homer's mother. She could not be the person she had been in the ordinary years before 1969, the person who had not yet encountered the circumstances that revealed what she was made of. She kissed Homer goodbye while he slept. She disappeared, and Homer woke up without her, and grew up without her, and became the adult he became, specifically shaped by the absence, specifically made by the wound, specifically limited and specifically suffering in the ways that losing your mother at 6 years old, with no explanation and no farewell, produces in a person. The reunion in Season 7 is one of the most carefully written scenes the show has produced. Homer, who has been told his mother was dead, encounters a woman at a cemetery who is visiting what she believes is his grave. She does not recognize him at first. He is 40 years old or close to it, and the last time she saw him he was 6 and sleeping. He is changed in ways that the years between would produce. But he proves who he is, and she knows him, and they have the reunion that they should have had decades earlier, and the show allows itself to be fully present in the emotional weight of that reunion without deflecting into comedy. A man who believed he was unloved finding out that he was loved ferociously, that his mother spent 27 years as a fugitive rather than compromise his safety by staying, that the absence which shaped his understanding of himself as someone who could be left was itself an act of love. This is not a small thing. This is a reorganization of identity. This is the specific experience of having the story you built your life on revealed to be true in a different way than you understood it. And then Burns recognizes her, and the FBI comes, and Homer has to say goodbye again. This time he knows why. This time he knows who is responsible. His employer, the man who signs his checks, the man who has kept him in Sector 7G for decades, who arranged his employment before Homer was old enough to understand the arrangement, who has been the permanent fixture of Homer's professional life in exactly the way that Burns arranged to become. The man who took his mother away when he was 6 years old is the same man who has been signing his paychecks since he was 22. And Homer does not connect these dots in a way that produces action. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not organize around the specific knowledge that he now has about the relationship between his employer and his family's history. He goes home. He goes to work the next day. He continues. This is not stupidity. This is the specific paralysis of someone whose psychological architecture was constructed by the very events he has just learned about, in such a way as to make confrontation of the kind the situation demands feel impossible. The crayon in his brain. The decades of radiation. The psychological formation of the child who was abandoned at 6 and spent the next 30 years being the kind of person who would not risk abandonment again. All of this conspires to make the action that the situation would seem to call for confront Burns, file the report, resign, refuse to be party to the arrangement, feel not like a choice but like an impossibility. Burns broke Homer as a child and then hired the broken version. The specific incapacity that makes Homer the ideal Sector 7G employee is the incapacity that Burns produced by driving Mona away. The tool that Burns uses to maintain his operation was forged by the act that created the need for the tool. The whole thing loops back on itself. A closed system of cause and effect that began in 1969 in a biological weapons laboratory and ends every weekday afternoon in Sector 7G, where Homer falls asleep at his console and the plant's violations continue unreported, and the cracked cooling towers keep leaking, and Springfield keeps drinking the water. Mona Simpson died in a later season. Homer sat beside her. He held her hand. He watched her go. The show gave this moment its full weight. No comedy. No cutaway. A man and his mother and 30 years of stolen time pressing down on both of them. Burns won that exchange. Burns won it in 1969, when he made the call to the FBI, and he has been winning it ever since, and it has cost the Simpson family 3 generations of specific damage that the family has never quite recovered from and never quite understood well enough to name. Mona understood it. At the end, she understood it clearly. She had spent 27 years as a fugitive with enough time to think about what the raid and Burns's response and the decades of hiding had cost her and cost her family. She understood the architecture of it, and she could not fix it. She could only be present at the end, when Homer was holding her hand, and make sure he knew he was loved. She did that. That part she did. Supplemental. The show that predicted the future extended analysis. Let's return to the prediction phenomenon with more care, because the quick dismissal and the quick embrace of it are both unsatisfying. And the interesting territory is between them. The show predicted a Trump presidency in the year 2000. This is the fact that most people cite first when the predictions come up, and it is genuinely striking. The episode in question aired 16 years before the 2016 election. The specific image of Trump descending an escalator, an image that became one of the iconic photographs of the 2016 campaign announcement, appears to rhyme with the episode's visual treatment of Trump's fictional political presence in ways that are specific enough to be striking. But here is what the show knew in 2000 about Donald Trump. It knew that Trump had been publicly flirting with running for president since at least 1988, when he first spoke openly about presidential ambitions in interviews and public statements. It knew that Trump was one of the most recognizable celebrities in America, a person whose specific public persona, the wealth, the self-promotion, the willingness to exist in any media context that would amplify his presence was as familiar to American culture as any politician. It knew that the trajectory of American celebrity culture was moving toward an increasing fusion of entertainment and political authority, that the entertainment industry's relationship to political discourse was changing in ways that made what would previously have seemed impossible seem merely improbable. And it knew that American politics has always had a specific appetite for outsider figures whose outsider status is itself a credential, whose claim to authority rests precisely on the claim that they are not the kind of person who usually holds authority. Given all of that, a joke in the year 2000 about Trump winning the presidency is not prophecy. It is the specific product of a group of writers who were paying close attention to trends that were already in motion and following them to conclusions that were, in retrospect, accurate, but that were, at the time, intended as hyperbole. The gap between what the joke predicted and what eventually happened is smaller than it appears, because the conditions that made the prediction possible were already present when the prediction was made. This is the interesting thing about the best predictions. They are not lucky guesses. They are the product of analytical intelligence applied to observable conditions, and the show's writing staff at its peak contained an unusual concentration of exactly that kind of analytical intelligence. People with advanced degrees in fields that teach systematic observation of complex systems. People who had spent their careers thinking carefully about how cultures work and where they tend to go. People who understood the mechanisms of American social and political life well enough to sketch their trajectories with some confidence. The Disney-Fox merger prediction operates the same way. The show depicted Disney acquiring Fox in 1998. Disney acquired Fox in 2019, 21 years later. This sounds like prophecy, but in 1998, media consolidation was one of the defining trends of the entertainment industry. The specific logic of the consolidation, larger entities acquiring smaller ones, branded content becoming the center of gravity around which distribution strategies organize themselves, the specific advantages that scale provides in negotiating with every other player in the ecosystem was visible in 1998 in ways that an attentive observer could follow forward. The specific companies involved are the interesting prediction, but the general trend was not a prediction at all. The more genuinely difficult to explain predictions are the ones where the specificity cannot be easily attributed to trend analysis. The smartwatch that appears in a 1995 episode. The sequence that anticipates details of a specific event involving specific people in ways that feel less like trend analysis and more like coincidence with too much precision to be comfortable. But even here, the proper calibration is not to reach for supernatural explanations or for the theory that the writers were somehow accessing information they should not have had access to. The proper calibration is to remember the volume. 788 episodes. Each episode containing dozens of specific images, specific characters doing specific things, specific predictions about specific technologies and specific cultural developments. The number of specific things the show has depicted across 36 years is enormous. The number of those specific things that have turned out to align with real events is a small fraction of the total, selected by the confirmation bias that remembers, hits, and forgets misses. The prediction phenomenon is not about the future. It is about the past, about the specific past of confirmation bias, about what happens when you filter 36 years of highly specific creative output through the attention of an audience looking for alignments between fiction and reality. You find them. Of course you find them. You are going to find them no matter what, because the output is large enough and specific enough that some fraction of it will align with any reality that develops for long enough. What makes The Simpsons predictions interesting is not that they are predictions, it is what they reveal about the show's analytical intelligence at its peak. The Trump prediction is interesting, not as prophecy but as evidence of the specific quality of observation that the show's writers brought to American culture in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The observation was good enough that when reality eventually caught up to it, the catch-up felt uncanny rather than inevitable. And that quality of observation is itself a remarkable thing. The show looked at America and saw it clearly enough that, 36 years later, the seeing still reads as sophisticated. The clarity did not belong to a lucky episode. It was a sustained property of the show at its best, and the predictions are the visible residue of that clarity, the places where the show's observation of the present was specific enough to function as a map of the future. That is the genuine achievement. Not prophecy, something harder and more interesting. The ability to see what is present clearly enough that where it is going becomes visible too. Supplemental. Springfield's geography and the mystery of where. Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history, and its location has never been definitively established. This is not an accident or an oversight. The show's decision to keep Springfield State unspecified has been maintained across 36 seasons, with a deliberateness that speaks to its function in the show's design. The show has placed Springfield in geographic contexts that are mutually contradictory. In one episode, it has oceanfront, in another, it is landlocked. It has mountains in some episodes and flat Midwestern terrain in others. It borders Ohio in one telling and Nevada in another. Its climate has ranged from the reliably harsh winters of the northern Midwest to the mild seasons of the Pacific Coast to the desert conditions of the Southwest, sometimes within a single season of episodes. No real American state contains all of these geographic features within the distance from Springfield that the show implies Springfield is from any given feature. The show is not depicting a real geography. It is depicting an American geography, a composite, a superposition of every American landscape that anyone on the writing staff has ever experienced or imagined, layered together without concern for physical possibility. This works, and it works so well that most viewers accept it without conscious processing, because Springfield's geographic impossibility reads as the geographic ambiguity of anywhere rather than the specific geographic impossibility of no place in particular. It feels like every American town, not because every American town has these features, but because the show has assembled the feeling of American townness from the most recognizable components of multiple American towns and combined them into a composite that triggers the recognition. Reflex without specifying any particular geographic reality. Matt Groening has said that Springfield is named after Springfield, Oregon, the town near where he grew up. He said this in 2012, and for approximately 48 hours, the mystery appeared to be solved. And then the show aired an episode that placed Springfield in a geographic context inconsistent with Oregon, and the writers confirmed that they were not honoring Groening's revelation as a constraint on the show's settings, and the mystery reopened. The mystery staying open is the point. Springfield's indefinite location is not a production limitation or a failure to commit to a decision that the show should have made at some point. It is the show's most elegant formal decision, to create a town that could be your town regardless of where your town is. If Springfield were definitively in Ohio, it would belong to Ohio viewers in a way that would place it at a slight remove from everyone else. The indefiniteness distributes the ownership. Springfield belongs to everyone who recognizes it, which is everyone who grew up in a version of it, which is most people who grew up in America. Under the radiation theory, the geographic impossibility is one more symptom of Springfield's warped reality. A town that sits in a zone of environmental contamination intense enough to affect the biology of its residents might affect more than biology. The space around Springfield has been warped by the same forces that warped its people. The mountains and the ocean and the desert and the farmland are not confused geography. They are the geography of a contaminated zone, where the normal rules of how places work have been as thoroughly altered as the normal rules of how people work. Under the coma theory, the geography is straightforwardly explained by the mechanics of dreaming. A dreaming mind does not navigate by map. It navigates by feeling, by association, by the specific texture of remembered experience. Homer has been to mountains. He has seen ocean. He has driven through farmland. He has experienced the specific ambiance of multiple American settings across his waking life. His dreaming mind, constructing Springfield from available materials, assembles it from all of these at once, because the dreaming mind does not recognize geographic contradiction as a problem. The mountain and the ocean can both be within driving distance of the Quickie Mart, because in Homer's dream, both are part of what home feels like, and the dream makes them spatially present simultaneously, because dreams are governed by emotional logic rather than geographic logic. Both theories arrive at the same conclusion. Springfield's geography is impossible because Springfield is impossible, and Springfield is impossible because something happened there that made it so. The geography is not incidental. It is the space that the something happened in, warped by the happening into its current unresolvable form. The location will never be confirmed. The show will continue placing Springfield in mutually contradictory settings, and the viewers will continue experiencing Springfield as somewhere they recognize, as the somewhere of everywhere American they have ever been, as the place that is always just familiar enough to feel like home. This is the last thing Burns could not have engineered. The specific quality of belonging that Springfield produces in its residents and in its viewers, the sense that this is a place that is yours, that has your name on it, that exists in the register of the personal. Burns controls the economics. Burns controls the political structure. Burns controls the media environment through his influence on the town's institutions. But he cannot control the feeling of home that emerged from the people of Springfield despite everything he has done, through the relationships and the shared experiences and the specific texture of existing together in the same place across decades of shared life. It is the one thing in Springfield that did not come from him and does not serve him, and that he has never quite managed to extinguish. Springfield is home because the people in it made it home, against every incentive the system provided for them not to. That, finally, is the thing worth saying. After all the theories, after all the analysis, after the full inventory of what Burns built and what the radiation did and what the denial maintains and what the coma dreams after all of it, what remains is the thing that cannot be explained by any of it. The people of Springfield love it. Imperfectly, inconsistently, with the specific love that complicated places produce in the people who call them home. The love is real even when nothing else about the place is clean. The community is genuine even when the structures within it are not. The life is worth living even inside the contamination zone, even inside the dream, even inside the arrangement that Burns built and that Burns benefits from. Homer comes home every evening. He walks through the door. The family is there. Something happens. Something always happens, and the episode plays out and resolves in some form or another, and next week it begins again. And in the space between the cracked cooling towers and the evening light coming through the kitchen window, something persists that all the theories in the world cannot fully account for. Springfield is a terrible town. Springfield is home. And the people who live there, for all the things the theories reveal about what they are living in, would not trade it. That is the thing that stays with you, long after the theories settle and the analysis quiets and the night gets late. Not the conspiracy, not the radiation, not the coma or the shadow government or the floating timeline. The family. Home. The beer is cold and the television is on and everyone who is supposed to be there is there. For now. For this episode. For 36 years and counting. Supplemental. What Homer's brain injury really means. We have talked about the crayon episode as evidence for the Sector 7G conspiracy. But the crayon episode is doing several things simultaneously, and the conspiracy layer is not even the most important one. The most important one is what it reveals about Homer's relationship to his own intelligence, and what that relationship reveals about the kind of world Springfield is. The crayon goes in during Homer's childhood. He was, the episode establishes, experimenting with objects in the way that children do, putting things in places they should not go, and a crayon lodged itself in his nasal cavity at an angle and a depth that caused it to physically press against portions of his brain associated with cognitive function. He has been living with this foreign object in his skull since he was a small child, and the result is that the intelligence he would have had without it has been, throughout his entire adult life, operating at significantly reduced capacity. This is presented as comedy. The crayon lodged in the brain is one of the show's most comedic pieces of canonical information about Homer, one of the facts about him that gets referenced and joked about and used as an explanation for the things he does that defy explanation. It is the Homer stupidity explanation taken to its literal extreme, not just a metaphor for Homer being limited, but an actual physical reason, with an actual physical object that can be pointed at. But when the crayon is removed and smart Homer emerges, the episode asks something that the comedy usually prevents it from asking. It asks what it would mean for Homer to be the person he would have been without the crayon. And the answer the episode gives is not triumphant. Smart Homer is not happy. Smart Homer is articulate and capable and fully in possession of his faculties, and he looks at Springfield with those faculties fully engaged, and what he sees is not something he can make peace with. He sees his job for what it is. He sees the arrangement he is inside. He sees the family clearly, the imperfections that love can usually soften into acceptance, and the clarity is not comfortable. He sees the town clearly, and the town is what we have been describing tonight. And seeing it clearly is not the same as being able to do anything about it. He has the intelligence to understand his situation. He does not have the power to change it. And understanding your situation without being able to change it is a specific and terrible form of suffering. So he chooses not to understand it. He has the crayon put back in. And the show treats this as a reasonable choice, presents it with a kind of sympathy, acknowledges the difficulty of what smart Homer is deciding, does not simply condemn him for choosing the fog over the clarity. This is the most honest thing the show has ever said about the relationship between intelligence and happiness in the specific context of Springfield. That intelligence, in Springfield, does not produce better outcomes. That clarity, in Springfield, does not lead to changed conditions. That the cognitive equipment required to see Springfield for what it is produces suffering rather than agency, because the agency required to do something about what you see is not available to a single man with a restored intelligence and a family that depends on the income from his unsafe job at the plant that is making the town sick. The crayon going back in is not a failure of courage. It is the rational response of someone who has accurately assessed the situation. Being able to see clearly is not useful if clear seeing leads only to being clearly miserable in conditions that clear seeing cannot change. The fog is not chosen because it is better. It is chosen because the alternative is unbearable and equally ineffective. Homer is not stupid. Homer is a person who has decided, on the evidence, that stupidity is a more livable condition than intelligence in the world he has been given. This is different from stupidity. This is something that is, in some respects, more intelligent than the intelligence that makes it necessary. And Burns knows this. Burns's system produces this. Springfield's conditions produce this. The town is full of people who have made the same calculation Homer made, in their own idioms, with their own specific forms of the fog. The beer, the television, the routine, the collective agreement to not ask the questions that would produce answers you cannot do anything about. The fog takes different forms in different people, but the function is always the same. Make the conditions bearable by reducing the capacity to see them clearly. Springfield is not a town of stupid people. Springfield is a town of people who have made a specific accommodation with the conditions they live in, an accommodation that requires them to see less than they could see, to ask less than they could ask, to accept less than they should have to accept. The accommodation is not chosen in the explicit way that Homer chose it with the crayon. It is produced by the conditions over decades of exposure through the specific mechanisms we have been discussing all night. But the result is the same. The crayon is in. The lights are on. The television is playing. Everything is fine. Everything is always fine in Springfield, right up until it isn't, and then it is fine again the next episode. Supplemental. The coma theory extended case. The coma theory deserves more space than it has received in the rest of tonight's discussion, because it is the theory that, more than any other, changes what you are watching when you watch The Simpsons. The setup is simple. In April 1993, in the 18th episode of Season 4, Homer falls into a coma. He is in the hospital. A vending machine falls on him. He flatlines. He is clinically unconscious. The episode resolves with Homer apparently waking up, his son Bart confessing at his bedside that the prank escalation that put Homer in the hospital was Bart's fault, Homer strangling Bart out of habit, the family laughing, and then the closing information that Homer has permanently lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. The coma theory proposes that Homer did not wake up. The episode shows you a recovery, but the recovery is part of the coma. It is the dreaming mind's version of recovery, generated by the unconscious brain that is still lying in a hospital bed and will continue to lie there. Everything that has aired since April 1993 is a dream. All of it. Every guest star, every impossible adventure, every episode that begins with the family on the couch and ends with everything back to normal. The dream of a man who went to sleep 30 years ago and has not yet stopped dreaming. The evidence that the theory's proponents find most compelling is the tonal shift between the pre-coma seasons and the post-coma ones. Before April 1993, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Not realistic in the sense of being documentary, but grounded in the sense that the situations it depicted were recognizable as human situations. Financial stress, marital tension, children struggling in school, the specific anxieties of lower middle-class domestic life. The satire was rooted. The comedy was generated from the gap between aspiration and reality in a recognizable world. After April 1993, the show's premises expand outward in ways that have no ceiling. Homer goes to space. Homer meets multiple presidents. Homer joins and leaves hundreds of different jobs in social organizations and subcultures. Homer survives things that would kill anyone who was made of the physical materials that characters in realistic fiction are made of. The world of the show stops being a version of the real world that has been slightly exaggerated for comedic effect and becomes a version of the world that generates its situations from its own internal logic, increasingly disconnected from any relationship to what the real world is like. This shift is real. People noticed it when it was happening. The debate about when The Simpsons peaked, which is one of the most stable debates in internet television discussion, consistently locates the peak in the pre-1993 seasons or in the seasons immediately following. The felt sense that something changed, that the show stopped doing something it used to do and started doing something different, maps onto the coma date with enough precision that the alignment is worth taking seriously. The coma theory's emotional core is what gives it staying power beyond the evidence. If Homer is dreaming, then what the show is doing is not comedy. It is a man dreaming about his family because his family is the thing he loves most and cannot reach. He is generating the children at the ages they were when he went under, because those are the ages he knows he cannot dream them older because he was not conscious to watch them become older. He is generating Marge as she was, because that is the Marge his memory holds. He is generating Springfield as the specific world he lived in, imperfect and specific and fully realized, because the dreaming mind is working from the only reference material it has, the world as it was on the day he lost it. Every episode, in this reading, is an act of love. A man who cannot reach his family generating them, over and over, in the only form available to him. Every impossible adventure is the dreaming mind's elaboration, the tendency of dreams to push past the probable into the spectacular, to offer the sleeping person everything they could not have while awake. Homer could not go to space while awake. In the dream, he can. The dream gives him what waking cannot. And the reset mechanism, the fact that every episode begins fresh, that the consequences of last week's catastrophe do not carry into this week, that Springfield is always intact on the other side of every disaster, this is not lazy writing. This is the dreaming mind's inability to sustain continuity across what are, to Homer's unconscious, distinct cycles of the dream. The brain resets because brains in comas cannot sustain continuous narrative across time. They generate and forget and generate again. Each episode is a separate dream, not a chapter in a continuous story. This is why nobody ages. Not the radiation, not the cartoon convention, not the floating timeline. Nobody ages because Homer cannot imagine them older. He does not know what older looks like. He went to sleep when Bart was 10 and Lisa was 8 and Maggie was 1 and Marge was 35, and those are the only versions of these people he has access to. The dream gives him what he knows, and the dream gives him what he needs. The family intact, the marriage holding, the children home, the beer cold, the couch available, the television on. It gives him home, over and over, in the only form it can. That is what the coma theory finally is. An explanation of why the show feels like it does, why it has the specific emotional texture of something that is both comedy and something else that comedy is not quite the right word for. Why the family's survival of each episode's disasters feels less like cartoon invincibility and more like grace. Homer is dreaming. The dream is generous. And we watch it every week because it gives us something too, the specific comfort of a family surviving everything, of home being always available, of the people we love being exactly as we left them every time we come back. That is the gift of Springfield. Whatever else it is. Supplemental. Bart and Lisa. The two ways intelligence can go in Springfield. There are two intelligent people in the Simpson household. Their intelligence manifests differently, is deployed differently, and produces different lives for them within the specific ecology of Springfield. Looking at them together reveals something about Springfield that looking at either of them alone does not. Bart is intelligent in the specific way of someone whose intelligence is oriented toward the immediate situation. He reads people with accuracy and speed. He makes assessments of social dynamics that are correct more often than they should be given his age. He identifies leverage points in any system he finds himself, in the specific place you can push to change the outcome, the specific vulnerability in any authority structure that can be exploited if you time it right. He is, in the immediate term domain, genuinely gifted. The things his intelligence does well, it does better than most adults. The limitation is temporal. Bart's intelligence does not scale well across time. The same capabilities that make him extraordinarily effective in the immediate situation, the responsiveness, the improvisational nature, the sensitivity to real-time cues, these qualities require the immediacy to operate. When the relevant information is in the room right now, when the outcome depends on reading the situation in the next few seconds, Bart is operating at something close to his ceiling. When the outcome depends on sustained planning, on attending to information that is not immediately present, on constructing sequences of action across extended time, here Bart is less well served by the intelligence he has. Lisa's intelligence is exactly the reverse. She is gifted in the temporal domain. She can hold complex structures in mind across extended periods. She can attend to information that is not immediately emotionally salient. She can construct arguments and analyses and plans that operate across multiple steps, that connect disparate pieces of information, that require the sustained cognitive organization that Bart's intelligence finds difficult to maintain. The limitation is social. Lisa's intelligence does not translate well into immediate social situations. She knows things and she says them, because the knowing and the saying are directly connected in her cognitive process in ways that Bart's intelligence interrupts with a social filter that considers whether this is a good moment to say the thing you know. Lisa does not have this filter, or has it less reliably. The truth is the truth, and the question of whether this is the right social moment for the truth is secondary to the question of whether the truth is available to be said. In a different world, Bart and Lisa's intelligences would complement each other perfectly. The temporal planning and analytical depth that Lisa has, combined with the social reading and situational responsiveness that Bart has, would constitute a genuinely formidable combined capability. They would be extraordinary together. Springfield has never given them the opportunity to be extraordinary together, because Springfield's specific dynamics require them to be separate from each other in their capabilities rather than combined. Lisa's intelligence, deployed publicly and analytically against Springfield's arrangements, makes her the isolated outsider. Bart's intelligence, deployed improvisationally within Springfield's immediate social ecology, makes him the misfit who fits in just enough to survive, without fitting in enough to be complicit. They are the two possibilities the show has identified for intelligent people in Springfield. Be Lisa and see everything clearly and be alone in your clarity, or be Bart and be quick enough and charming enough to navigate without ever quite committing to the navigation as your life's project. Neither option is good. Neither option is what the intelligence deserves. Springfield does not have a third option, because the third option, the option where intelligence is recognized and given the context to develop into something, would require the kind of institutional investment in its residents' flourishing that Burns's arrangement can never permit. Investing in the residents' flourishing would be investing in the residents' capability to understand what is happening to them. And that capability is exactly what the arrangement is designed to prevent. So, Lisa sees clearly and is isolated, and Bart navigates brilliantly and goes nowhere. And the two of them sit at opposite ends of the dinner table, and Homer is between them falling asleep, and Marge is serving dinner with the patience that she has extended for 36 years without it running out, and Maggie is watching everything. And Springfield continues, and the cooling towers glow in the distance, faintly, just visible through the kitchen window. And it is dinner time on Evergreen Terrace, and this is what it has always looked like, and this is what it will always look like, and there is something in this that is too familiar to be entirely dark and too dark to be entirely comfortable. Something that is, in the end, just what it is. 36 years, the same family, the same house, the same imperfect, specific, unrepeatable life. Whatever Springfield is, and tonight we have suggested many things it might be, it is also this. The table set, the family there, the evening beginning. Nothing lasts and everything lasts. Springfield proves it every week. Good night. Supplemental. Springfield's music what gets said when words won't do. There is a quality that The Simpsons has that is difficult to attribute to any single element of its production. A quality that makes certain moments in the show feel like more than comedy, like more than satire, like something in the register of genuine feeling that the show only accesses in specific, carefully prepared circumstances. That quality has a great deal to do with the music. Alf Clausen composed music for The Simpsons across its run, and what he built episode by episode across decades of scoring is one of the most extensive and emotionally sophisticated bodies of work in the history of American television. The scores are not background. They are not the functional, music-shaped content that fills the space between dialogue in most television production. They are specific and responsive to the specific emotional content of the specific moment they are scoring, in ways that require having understood deeply what the moment is about. The music knows when to be funny. It knows when to undercut the comedy. It knows when to play the emotion straight, when to withhold the emotional cue that would tell the viewer how to feel, and let the image and the dialogue carry the full weight of the moment without assistance. It knows when Homer's stupidity is purely comedic and when it is carrying something genuine underneath the comedy that the score should acknowledge rather than paper over. The moments where the music shifts from comedic scoring to something else are the moments the show trusts most. The moment at the end of Mother Simpson when Mona has left again, and Homer drives out to a hill and parks and sits looking at the stars, and the music that plays is not comedy and is not resolution, but is something that does not have a name in the vocabulary of television genre, something that is the feeling of a man sitting with his losses in the dark. The moment works because the music tells the truth about it rather than packaging it for comfortable consumption. This is what the score across the show's run has consistently done at its best. It has told the truth about what is happening emotionally in scenes that the comedy could excuse from having to be emotionally true. It has insisted on the feeling being real, even in a cartoon, even in a comedy, even in an episode that is mostly about something much lighter than the feeling the score is playing in a specific 30-second window. The show's relationship to music is also its relationship to a certain kind of humanity that persists beneath the satire. You can satirize institutions. You can satirize power structures. You can satirize the specific dysfunction of a specific fictional town, and by extension of the real world, the fictional town is reflecting. But the music in the moment when Homer sits on that hill does not satirize anything. It is not ironic. It is not performing. It is the show's deepest voice, saying something it cannot say in dialogue and cannot depict in image alone, something that requires the specific medium of music to carry. Lisa's saxophone is the symbol of this. She plays it badly at first and then better and eventually with a skill and an emotional depth that the show consistently treats as one of the genuine goods of Springfield's world. When Lisa plays, the music she makes is not a joke. It is not the show using a child's aspiration for comedic effect. It is the show insisting that this specific person's relationship to this specific art form is real and valuable and worth the screen time it takes to depict. In a town that has been described tonight as a contamination zone, as a system designed to diminish its residents, as a collective agreement to not see clearly in that town, a girl plays saxophone by her bedroom window every evening. The music she makes goes out into the Springfield night, and it is genuinely good, and it is genuinely hers, and it is the one thing in her Springfield life that the town cannot co-opt or diminish or redirect toward what the arrangement needs. The music is the evidence that Springfield is not only what the theories say it is, that inside the contaminated system, inside the dreaming mind, inside the collective denial, inside all of it, there is still the saxophone in the evening, still the score that tells the truth about the moment, still the specific sound of a person expressing something that the structure around them cannot contain. Burns does not control the music. The radiation does not reach into it. The collective amnesia does not erase it. The floating timeline does not repeat it. Because each time it is played, it is new, it is now. It is the specific expression of the specific person playing it in this specific moment that will not be this moment again. This is what survives in Springfield. This is what the theories cannot account for. Not because the theories are wrong, but because the theories describe the system, and the music exists outside the system, in the space that systems cannot quite reach. The space where things are simply what they are because someone chose to make them so. Lisa plays. Springfield listens, or does not listen, or is too damaged or too busy or too compliant to properly attend to what it is hearing. But the music goes out anyway, into the cooling tower-lit night, into the world that the theories describe and that the music transcends. It goes out. It has always gone out. And it will be there, going out, as long as there is a Springfield to go out into. Which, if the floating timeline holds, is forever. Good night, Springfield. You have earned it.